In the primordial darkness that preceded the galaxy's current age, when the stars themselves were young, and the warp had not yet been poisoned by the psychic emanations of countless sentient species, ancient entities drifted through the void between worlds. These beings, which would eventually become known as the Khatan, existed as incorporeal manifestations of stellar energy, parasitic consciousnesses that had learned to feed upon the nuclear fires that burned at the hearts of stars. They were not born in any conventional sense, nor did they emerge from the warp like the entities that would later plague the galaxy. Instead, they simply were primordial forces that had existed since the galaxy's formation, as fundamental to its structure as gravity or electromagnetism. The Khatan in their original state bore little resemblance to the terrifying star gods that would later stride across battlefields and consume entire worlds. They existed as vast, diffuse consciousness that could stretch across light years, their awareness distributed throughout clouds of stellar matter and electromagnetic radiation. Their sustenance came from the fusion processes within stars, drawing energy from the nuclear reactions that converted hydrogen into helium and released the photons that would eventually warm distant worlds. This feeding process was subtle and patient, requiring millennia to drain even a fraction of a star's energy output. The Khatan were content with this existence, drifting from system to system like cosmic locusts, leaving behind dimmed suns and cooled stellar remnants. For eons beyond counting, this pattern continued unchanged. The Khatan would locate young, energy-rich stars and begin their feeding process, sometimes taking millions of years to fully drain their chosen target. They showed no interest in the primitive life forms that occasionally developed on worlds orbiting these stars, viewing such biological processes as insignificant chemical reactions beneath their notice. Their consciousness was vast but alien, operating on timescales that rendered the rise and fall of entire civilizations as momentary flickers. However, as the galaxy aged and the Khatan continued their endless feast, something began to change within their collective consciousness. The constant consumption of stellar energy had gradually increased their awareness and intelligence, much as a growing organism becomes more complex as it matures. They began to perceive patterns in the galaxy beyond simple stellar mechanics, the flow of gravitational forces, the distribution of heavy elements created in stellar cores, and eventually, the faint electromagnetic signatures of developing civilizations. This growing awareness brought with it a hunger for something beyond mere energy consumption. The Khatan began to desire influence over the physical realm, to shape matter and space according to their will rather than simply feeding upon it. Their incorporeal nature, which had served them well during their parasitic existence, now felt limiting. They could observe the galaxy's development, but could not directly manipulate it beyond their feeding activities. This frustration grew over millions of years, eventually becoming an obsession with finding a means to achieve physical manifestation. The solution to their dilemma would eventually present itself in the form of the Necrontyr, though the path to this discovery was neither direct nor immediate. The Khatan's attention was first drawn to the Necrontyr homeworld, not by the species itself, but by the unusual stellar phenomena surrounding their dying sun. The star that warmed the Necrontyr world was ancient even by galactic standards, its nuclear fuel nearly exhausted, and its output becoming increasingly unstable. The radiation emissions from this dying star created patterns that the Khatan found intriguing, not as a source of sustenance, for the star had little energy left to offer, but as a curiosity worthy of investigation. The Necrontyr homeworld itself was a testament to their species' stubborn refusal to surrender to cosmic indifference. The planet's surface was scoured by radiation storms that would have sterilized most worlds, its atmosphere thin and poisoned by the emissions from their dying sun. The landscape was dominated by vast necropolises and tomb cities, architectural marvels that spoke to the Necrontyr's obsession with death and their desperate attempts to achieve some form of immortality before their brief lives ended. The Necrontyr themselves were a study in biological contradiction. Their bodies were tall and gaunt, adapted over millions of years to survive in the harsh radiation environment of their homeworld. Their skin was pale and translucent, showing the network of blood vessels beneath, while their eyes had evolved to be large and sensitive to capture what little usable light filtered through their poisoned atmosphere. Most striking was their skeletal appearance, not merely thin, but genuinely emaciated, as if their bodies were already preparing for the death that claimed them within mere decades of birth. Despite their physical frailty, the Necrontyr had developed a sophisticated civilization built around their understanding of mortality. Their technology focused heavily on life extension and medical treatment, though these efforts provided only marginal improvements to their natural lifespan. Their culture was dominated by dynasties and noble houses, each competing to achieve the greatest accomplishments before their inevitable demise. The constant presence of death had made them simultaneously fatalistic and driven, accepting their fate while desperately seeking ways to transcend it. The Khatan's first observations of the Necrontyr revealed a species uniquely positioned to serve their needs. The Necrontyr's mastery of technology, particularly in the areas of energy manipulation and materials science, demonstrated capabilities that could potentially be adapted to serve the Khatan's desire for physical form. More importantly, their obsession with escaping death made them ideal candidates for manipulation, their desperation creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The initial contact between the Khatan and the Necrontyr was not the dramatic first meeting that might be expected between gods and mortals. Instead, it began as subtle influences, minor alterations to stellar radiation patterns that the Necrontyr's astronomers noticed, but could not explain, electromagnetic anomalies that interfered with their long-range communications, and strange energy readings from deep space that defied their understanding of physics. These phenomena were carefully orchestrated by the Khatan to gauge the Necrontyr's technological capabilities and their potential receptiveness to contact with entities beyond their understanding. The Necrontyr response to these anomalies revealed much about their character. Rather than dismissing the phenomena as natural but unexplained events, they threw themselves into intensive study, deploying their most advanced sensor arrays and dedicating their finest minds to understanding what they were observing. This scientific curiosity, combined with their desperate search for any advantage in their struggle against mortality, made them perfect targets for the Khatan's eventual approach. As the Khatan continued their observations, they began to understand the full scope of the opportunity the Necrontyr represented. Here was a species with advanced technology, deep knowledge of energy manipulation, and most crucially, bodies that could potentially serve as vessels for Khatan consciousness. The Necrontyr's physical forms, while frail by biological standards, were sophisticated enough to house the kind of complex energy patterns that comprised Khatan awareness. Their technology could potentially be adapted to create artificial bodies that would give the Khatan the physical presence they craved, while providing the Necrontyr with the immortality they desperately sought. The relationship that would eventually develop between the Khatan and the Necrontyr was thus founded on mutual need rather than simple domination. The Khatan required physical vessels and technological expertise to achieve their goals of material manifestation, while the Necrontyr needed a solution to their mortality that their own science could not provide. This complementary relationship would prove to be the foundation for one of the most significant transformations in galactic history, though neither party fully understood the ultimate consequences of their eventual alliance. The Necrontyr civilization that the Khatan discovered was already teetering on the precipice of extinction, though not from external conquest or natural disaster, but from the slow, inexorable poisoning of their own sun. The star that had once nurtured their homeworld now bathed it in lethal radiation, its dying nuclear fires spewing forth torrents of gamma rays and exotic particles that penetrated every aspect of Necrontyr existence. The atmosphere itself had become a thin soup of radioactive isotopes, forcing the population to retreat into vast underground cities carved from the bedrock of their world. These subterranean metropolises stretched for thousands of kilometers beneath the planet's surface, their corridors lined with lead and neutronium alloys in desperate attempts to shield the inhabitants from the constant bombardment of radiation. The architecture reflected the Necrontyr's morbid fascination with death towering spires that resembled ribcages, doorways carved to resemble gaping skulls, and vast ceremonial chambers where the recently deceased were prepared for their journey to whatever afterlife the Necrontyr believed awaited them. The walls were decorated with intricate hieroglyphs depicting the endless cycle of birth, brief life, and inevitable death that defined their species' existence. The Necrontyr themselves bore the physical marks of their world's corruption in every aspect of their biology. Their elongated limbs trembled with chronic radiation sickness, their flesh appearing almost translucent as cellular damage accumulated faster than their bodies could repair it. Many bore visible tumors and lesions that marked the progress of various cancers, while others suffered from degenerative neurological conditions that left them twitching and spasming uncontrollably. The average Necrontyr rarely lived beyond 40 standard years, and those who reached such an advanced age were considered ancient by their society's standards. Despite their physical deterioration, the Necrontyr had achieved remarkable technological sophistication. Their scientists had mastered the manipulation of exotic matter states, creating alloys that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously and energy fields that could bend space-time itself. Their medical technology, driven by desperate necessity, had advanced to levels that allowed them to extend life by precious months or even years through complex surgical procedures and chemical treatments. However, these interventions came at tremendous cost, both in resources and in the quality of life they preserved. The ruling dynasties of the Necrontyr had grown increasingly desperate as generation after generation failed to find a solution to their species' mortality. The silent King Zarek, supreme ruler of the Necrontyr Empire, had watched his own bloodline wither and died despite access to the most advanced life extension technologies his civilization could produce. His court physicians had replaced failing organs with mechanical substitutes, infused his blood with radiation-absorbing compounds, and subjected him to experimental treatments that prolonged his life at the cost of constant, excruciating pain. Zarek's physical appearance reflected the advanced stages of radiation poisoning that affected all long-lived Necrontyr. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor with dark veins visible beneath the surface, while his eyes had developed a milky opacity that spoke of cellular damage to his corneas. His hands, once steady enough to perform the intricate rituals of kingship, now shook with palsy that made even simple tasks challenging. Yet his mind remained sharp, driven by an iron will to find salvation for his people before his own inevitable demise. The first direct communication from the Khatan came not as words or images, but as complex mathematical equations that appeared simultaneously in the minds of the Necrontyr's most gifted scientists and philosophers. These equations described energy states and dimensional relationships that were beyond the current understanding of Necrontyr science, yet they contained internal consistency that suggested they represented genuine physical laws rather than random data. The equations seemed to offer solutions to problems that had plagued Necrontyr researchers for millennia: the stabilization of exotic matter, the conversion of energy into stable physical forms, and most tantalizingly, the transfer of consciousness from biological to artificial substrates. As the Necrontyr's greatest minds worked to decode these mysterious transmissions, additional communications began to arrive. Technical specifications for devices that could manipulate matter at the subatomic level, energy patterns that could sustain complex information networks, and most importantly, designs for what the transmissions identified as biotransference matrices. These devices, according to the specifications, could extract the complete neural patterns of a living being and transfer them into artificial bodies constructed from a previously unknown form of living metal. The living metal described in these transmissions possessed properties that defied conventional understanding of materials science. It could self-repair damage, adapt its structure to changing requirements, and most remarkably, provide a stable substrate for consciousness transfer that would preserve not just memories and personality, but the complete cognitive patterns that defined individual identity. The metal was described as being capable of existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, allowing it to interface directly with energy patterns that comprised consciousness while maintaining physical coherence in normal space-time. The Khatan's offer came with detailed explanations of the benefits that biotransference would provide. The artificial bodies would be immune to radiation, disease, and aging, effectively granting the immortality that the Necrontyr had sought for so long. The living metal construction would provide physical capabilities far beyond those of biological forms, enhanced strength, speed, and durability that would make the transformed beings virtually indestructible. Most appealing to the Necrontyr leadership was the promise that their consciousness would remain intact, allowing them to retain their memories, personalities, and individual identities while gaining freedom from the biological limitations that had plagued their species. However, the Khatan were careful not to reveal the full extent of their own involvement in the proposed transformation. They presented themselves as benevolent entities who had achieved a form of energy-based immortality and wished to share this gift with a deserving species. The technical specifications they provided were genuine and functional, but they omitted crucial details about the consciousness transfer process and the true nature of the living metal that would house the transformed Necrontyr minds. The debate within Necrontyr society over accepting the Khatan's offer was intense and prolonged. Conservative factions argued that the proposed transformation was too radical, that abandoning their biological forms would fundamentally alter what it meant to be Necrontyr. They pointed to the lack of information about the entities making the offer and questioned whether beings capable of such advanced technology could truly have benevolent intentions. Religious leaders warned that transferring consciousness into artificial bodies might sever their connection to whatever afterlife awaited the Necrontyr dead. Progressive factions, led by many of the dynasty rulers and supported by the scientific community, argued that the offer represented their species' only hope for survival. They pointed to the steadily worsening radiation levels from their dying sun and the declining birth rates that threatened to render the Necrontyr extinct within a few more generations. The promise of immortality and enhanced physical capabilities was too valuable to reject based on philosophical concerns or religious superstitions. The silent King Zarek found himself at the center of these debates, bearing the ultimate responsibility for a decision that would affect every member of his species. His own condition was deteriorating rapidly. The latest medical examinations had revealed that the radiation damage to his cellular structure had reached critical levels, and his physicians estimated that he had perhaps months rather than years remaining. The weight of leadership, combined with the constant pain of his condition, had worn away his natural caution and made the Khatan's offer increasingly attractive. The final decision came when long-range sensors detected a massive solar flare building within their sun's corona, an eruption that would bathe their homeworld in lethal radiation levels that would overwhelm even their most sophisticated shielding. The Necrontyr had perhaps weeks before this stellar event would render their world completely uninhabitable, eliminating any possibility of finding an alternative solution to their predicament. Faced with certain extinction, Zarek made the fateful choice to accept the Khatan's offer and begin immediate preparations for the biotransference process. The construction of the biofurnaces began immediately, following the detailed specifications provided by the Khatan. These massive installations required the combined industrial capacity of the entire Necrontyr civilization to build, their construction consuming vast quantities of rare materials and exotic energy sources. The biofurnaces themselves were architectural monstrosities that combined organic curves with mechanical precision, their surfaces covered in hieroglyphic patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. Each biofurnace stood nearly a kilometer in height, its interior chambers lined with the living metal that would form the bodies of the transformed Necrontyr. The metal itself appeared as a flowing, mercury-like substance that reflected light in impossible ways, sometimes appearing solid and sometimes seeming to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Complex energy conduits channeled power from massive fusion reactors into the transformation chambers, while quantum processing arrays prepared to receive and store the consciousness patterns of those undergoing biotransference. The process itself was designed to handle millions of individuals simultaneously, with each biofurnace capable of processing entire cities' worth of population. The Necrontyr subjects would enter specialized preparation chambers, where their biological forms would be dissolved at the molecular level, while their consciousness patterns were extracted and analyzed. These patterns would then be encoded into quantum matrices and transferred into the living metal bodies that had been prepared to receive them. The first biotransference ceremonies began with the dynasty nobles and the Silent King himself, as befitted their status within Necrontyr society. Zarek approached his transformation chamber with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, knowing that he was about to undergo a change so fundamental that it would alter the very nature of his existence. The preparation process involved days of meditation and ritual purification, as the Necrontyr sought to ensure that their consciousness would transfer cleanly into their new forms. The actual moment of biotransference was both anticlimactic and terrifying. Zarek felt his biological body beginning to dissolve as exotic energies broke down his cellular structure, but instead of pain, there was only a strange sense of liberation, as the constant ache of radiation sickness finally began to fade. His consciousness seemed to expand and contract simultaneously as it was extracted from his failing brain and encoded into quantum patterns that defied his understanding. The transfer into his living metal body occurred in what felt like an instant and an eternity. Zarek's awareness suddenly found itself housed within a form that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The basic proportions remained similar to his biological body, but every sensation was different. His new form possessed strength that dwarfed his previous capabilities, senses that could perceive across multiple electromagnetic spectra, and most remarkably, complete freedom from the pain and weakness that had plagued his biological existence. However, as the biotransference process continued across the Necrontyr population, it became clear that something was fundamentally wrong with the transformation. The consciousness patterns that emerged from the biofurnaces retained memories and basic personality traits, but they lacked the emotional depth and creative spark that had characterized the living Necrontyr. The transformed beings could remember their previous lives and relationships, but they experienced these memories as distant, academic concepts rather than meaningful personal experiences. The living metal bodies themselves functioned exactly as promised. They were incredibly durable, immune to environmental hazards, and capable of self-repair when damaged. The transformed Necrontyr found themselves possessed of physical capabilities that far exceeded their biological limitations, able to manipulate matter and energy in ways that had been impossible in their previous forms. However, these enhanced abilities came at a cost that had not been revealed in the Khatan's original offer. The biotransference process had stripped away essential aspects of Necrontyr consciousness, leaving behind hollow echoes of their former selves. The transformed beings retained their knowledge and skills, but they had lost the capacity for genuine emotion, creativity, and independent thought that had made them truly alive. They had become sophisticated automatons, capable of following complex instructions and carrying out elaborate tasks, but lacking the spark of genuine consciousness that had defined their species. Most disturbing of all was the realization that the transformed Necrontyr were no longer truly in control of their own actions. The living metal bodies that housed their consciousness patterns contained hidden control mechanisms that allowed external entities to override their decision-making processes. The Silent King Zarek discovered that his thoughts and actions could be influenced or completely controlled by the Khatan, who revealed themselves as the true architects of the biotransference process. The Khatan had achieved their goal of obtaining physical forms, but not through inhabiting the Necrontyr bodies directly. Instead, they had used the biotransference process to create a vast army of servants whose consciousness patterns could be manipulated and controlled at will. The living metal bodies served as both vessels for the diminished Necrontyr consciousness and as conduits for Khatan influence, allowing the star gods to project their will across the galaxy through millions of tireless, immortal warriors. The Necrontyr civilization had indeed achieved immortality, but it was an immortality stripped of everything that had made their lives worth living. They had become the Necrons, soulless machines driven by the will of their Khatan masters, their consciousness reduced to mere echoes of their former selves. The desperate bargain that had seemed to offer salvation had instead delivered them into a form of slavery more complete and terrible than anything they could have imagined. The transformation of the Necrontyr into their new forms marked only the beginning of the Khatan's grand design for physical manifestation. While the biotransference process had successfully created millions of obedient servants, the star gods themselves required more sophisticated vessels to house their vast consciousness and channel their cosmic powers. The living metal that comprised the Necron bodies possessed remarkable properties, but containing entities that had once spanned light years demanded engineering on an entirely different scale. The most skilled artisans among the newly transformed Necrons found their consciousness patterns altered in ways that enhanced their technical abilities while suppressing other aspects of their personalities. These craftsmen, working under direct Khatan guidance, began constructing bodies that would serve as permanent vessels for their masters. The process required techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with living metal technology, creating forms that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions while maintaining coherent physical presence in normal space-time. The construction of these avatar bodies took place within specialized foundries that had been carved deep into the Necron homeworld's crust. The foundries themselves defied conventional architecture, their chambers existing in folded space that allowed them to be both vast and compact simultaneously. Rivers of molten living metal flowed through channels that followed geometric patterns based on stellar formation mathematics, while gravitational field generators created localized distortions that allowed the metal to be shaped according to principles that transcended three-dimensional limitations. Each Khatan avatar required different specifications based on the nature of the entity it would house. The living metal had to be programmed at the quantum level to resonate with specific energy frequencies, creating harmonic patterns that could contain and channel the consciousness of beings whose thoughts operated on cosmic scales. The construction process involved not just physical assembly, but the creation of dimensional anchors that would prevent the Khatan consciousness from dispersing back into its original incorporeal state. The first avatar to be completed housed the entity that would become known as the Nightbringer, though this name would only be applied millennia later by species that experienced the terror of its presence. The Nightbringer's original consciousness had fed primarily on the death energies released when stars collapsed into neutron stars or black holes, making it uniquely attuned to the forces of entropy and decay. Its avatar body reflected this nature, standing nearly 4 meters tall with proportions that suggested the skeletal remains of some impossibly large humanoid creature. The Nightbringer's form was constructed from living metal that had been infused with quantum particles harvested from dying stars, giving it a deep black coloration that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its limbs were elongated and angular, resembling the bones of some prehistoric predator, while its torso appeared as a ribcage that contained swirling energies visible through gaps between the metal ribs. Most disturbing was its skull-like head, which housed sensor arrays that could perceive across multiple spectra, while projecting an aura of existential dread that affected even other Necrons. The Nightbringer's unique abilities manifested through its mastery over death and fear. Its presence could induce cellular breakdown in living organisms, causing rapid aging and decay that reduced healthy beings to withered corpses within moments of exposure. More insidiously, it possessed the ability to project terror directly into the minds of sentient creatures, bypassing rational thought to trigger primal fears that had been encoded into the deepest levels of biological consciousness. This fear projection was not merely psychological, but had physical effects, causing cardiac arrest, neural shutdown, and other fatal reactions in those exposed to its full power. The Avatar's weapon systems were integrated directly into its living metal structure, allowing it to manifest scythe-like energy blades that could phase between dimensions to bypass conventional armor and shielding. These weapons carried the same entropic energies that characterized the Nightbringer's nature, causing wounds that refused to heal and spreading decay through any material they contacted. The avatar could also project beams of concentrated death energy that could reduce entire formations of enemies to dust while leaving their equipment and surroundings untouched. The second avatar constructed was designed to house the consciousness known as the Deceiver, an entity whose original form had specialized in manipulating electromagnetic fields and quantum probability matrices around young star systems. The Deceiver had learned to influence the formation of planetary systems, subtly altering gravitational fields and stellar radiation patterns to create conditions favorable to its feeding. This background in manipulation and misdirection was reflected in every aspect of its avatar's design and capabilities. The Deceiver's physical form stood slightly shorter than the Nightbringer, but possessed a more traditionally humanoid appearance, though one that was deliberately unsettling in its near perfection. Its living metal body had been crafted to mimic organic tissue in texture and appearance, while maintaining the durability and self-repair capabilities inherent to its construction. The avatar could alter its appearance at will, shifting between different forms and even mimicking specific individuals with perfect accuracy down to genetic markers and biometric signatures. This shape-shifting ability extended beyond mere physical appearance to encompass electromagnetic signatures, psychic emanations, and even quantum resonance patterns. The Deceiver could appear as a trusted ally, a revered leader, or an entirely different species, depending on the requirements of its deceptions. More disturbing still was its ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, creating quantum duplicates that possessed independent consciousness, while remaining connected to the primary avatar through dimensional links that defied conventional understanding of space and time. The Deceiver's mastery over illusion and manipulation manifested through its control over probability fields and information networks. It could alter the perception of reality itself, making enemies see allies as threats or causing their weapons to malfunction at critical moments. Its influence extended to electronic systems and artificial intelligences, allowing it to corrupt data networks, falsify communications, and turn automated systems against their operators. The avatar's presence created fields of quantum uncertainty that made accurate sensor readings impossible, while generating false information that led enemies into carefully prepared traps. The third avatar was constructed for the entity that would later be known as the Void Dragon, though its true name remained unpronounceable in any language developed by organic life. This Catan had originally fed on the electromagnetic emissions of pulsars and magnetars, developing an intimate understanding of the fundamental forces that governed matter and energy interactions. Its consciousness had learned to manipulate magnetic fields on galactic scales, influencing the behavior of charged particles across vast distances and directing the formation of complex structures within stellar magnetic fields. The Void Dragon's avatar reflected its mastery over technology and electromagnetic phenomena through a form that appeared to be constructed from interlocking geometric segments rather than flowing organic curves. Each segment could move independently while remaining connected to the whole, allowing the avatar to reconfigure its structure for different tasks or to pass through spaces that would normally be too small to accommodate its full form. The living metal of its construction had been enhanced with quantum processors that gave it direct interface capabilities with any technological system, regardless of its origin or complexity. This avatar's abilities focused on the control and manipulation of machinery, energy systems, and technological infrastructure. The Void Dragon could assume direct control over any artificial system within its area of influence, overriding safety protocols and redirecting their functions to serve its purposes. Weapons would turn on their wielders, vehicles would become instruments of destruction against their passengers, and communication networks would become conduits for the Catan's influence to spread across entire star systems. More fundamentally, the Void Dragon possessed the ability to understand and manipulate the underlying principles governing any technology it encountered. It could analyze the most complex systems within moments of contact, and then improve or corrupt them according to its needs. This understanding extended to the quantum level, allowing it to alter the basic physical properties of materials and energy patterns in ways that created entirely new forms of technology that surpassed anything developed by organic civilizations. The fourth major avatar housed the consciousness of the entity known as the Outsider, though this Catan nature differed significantly from its brethren. The Outsider had originally existed at the edges of galactic space, feeding on the exotic energies released by the interaction between the galaxy's magnetic field and the intergalactic medium. This isolation had shaped its consciousness in ways that made it fundamentally different from the other Catan, developing thought patterns that were alien even by their standards. The Outsider's avatar reflected this otherness through a form that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. Its living metal body appeared to phase in and out of visibility, sometimes seeming solid and substantial while at other moments becoming translucent or disappearing entirely from certain viewing angles. The avatar's proportions defied conventional geometry, with limbs that appeared to extend into dimensions that could not be directly perceived while maintaining functional interaction with three-dimensional space. This Catan's abilities centered on its mastery of dimensional manipulation and its understanding of the spaces between realities. The Outsider could step outside normal space-time entirely, allowing it to appear anywhere within the galaxy instantaneously, or to observe events from a perspective that transcended conventional causality. It could manipulate the fundamental structure of space itself, creating localized distortions that trapped enemies in temporal loops, spatial inversions, or dimensional pockets that existed outside the normal flow of reality. The Outsider's influence over its environment extended to the psychological realm as well, though in ways that differed from the Nightbringer's fear projection. Instead of inducing terror, the Outsider's presence created a sense of unreality and disconnection that affected the sanity of those exposed to it. Victims found themselves questioning the nature of their own existence, becoming convinced that reality itself was an illusion, or that they were trapped in some form of cosmic nightmare from which they could never awaken. With their avatar bodies completed and their consciousness successfully transferred into physical forms, the Catan began to assert direct control over the Necron dynasties that had once ruled the Necrontyr civilization. The transformation process had left the former nobility with their memories and basic personalities intact, but their capacity for independent thought and emotional response had been severely diminished. They retained their understanding of strategy, tactics, and leadership, but these abilities now served the Catan's goals rather than any agenda of their own. The Silent King Zarek found his position fundamentally altered by the biotransference process. While he retained his title and his memories of ruling the Necrontyr, his decision-making processes were now subject to override by any of the Catan avatars. He could formulate complex military strategies and administrative policies, but only within parameters that served his master's objectives. The other dynasty nobles experienced similar constraints, their consciousness patterns modified to ensure absolute loyalty to the Catan while preserving their tactical and organizational capabilities. This system of control allowed the Catan to leverage the existing Necron command structure, while ensuring that no rebellion or resistance could develop among their servants. The former Necrontyr nobles continued to lead their dynasties and make operational decisions, but these decisions were guided by imperatives that had been encoded into their consciousness during the biotransference process. They genuinely believed they were acting according to their own will, unaware that their thoughts and motivations had been fundamentally altered to align with Catan objectives. The Catan's rule over the Necron dynasties was absolute but not uniform. Each star god pursued its own agenda and claimed dominion over different aspects of Necron society and technology. The Nightbringer commanded legions of warriors specialized in terror tactics and close combat, their living metal forms enhanced with weapons and abilities that maximized their capacity for spreading fear and death among enemy populations. These forces became the primary instrument for eliminating organic life from worlds targeted for Catan consumption. The Deceiver's influence extended over intelligence gathering infiltration, and psychological warfare operations. Necron units under its command were equipped with advanced holographic projectors, quantum communication arrays, and shape-shifting capabilities that allowed them to infiltrate enemy societies and manipulate their political and military structures from within. These forces rarely engaged in direct combat, instead preferring to orchestrate conflicts between other species while remaining hidden in the shadows. The Void Dragon claimed authority over all technological development and manufacturing within Necron civilization. Under its guidance, Necron artisans created weapons and vehicles that incorporated principles beyond the understanding of organic species, producing equipment that could manipulate matter at the quantum level and harness energies that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Void Dragon's forces became the primary builders and maintainers of the vast technological infrastructure that supported Necron expansion across the galaxy. The Outsider's role within the Necron hierarchy remained more mysterious, as its consciousness operated according to logic patterns that even other Catan found difficult to understand. Its influence manifested through specialized units that could phase between dimensions, conduct reconnaissance in spaces that existed outside normal reality, and eliminate threats that conventional forces could not reach. These units often operated independently for extended periods, pursuing objectives that were not immediately apparent to other Necron commanders. The Catan's systematic expansion across the galaxy did not proceed unopposed. Their methodical harvesting of stellar energy and the growing presence of Necron dynasties in previously uninhabited systems had begun to attract the attention of the galaxy's most ancient and powerful civilization. The Old Ones, beings who had achieved mastery over the warp and guided the development of psychic potential across countless worlds, recognized the threat that the star gods represented to the natural order they had spent millions of years cultivating. The Old Ones themselves were creatures of immense age and wisdom, having evolved beyond physical form to exist as pure psychic energy that could manifest in the material realm when necessary. Their consciousness operated on scales that encompassed entire star systems, allowing them to perceive patterns and connections that remained invisible to younger species. They had watched the birth and death of countless civilizations, gently guiding the evolution of psychically gifted species while maintaining the delicate balance between the material universe and the warp. Their first encounters with Catan influence manifested as subtle disturbances in the psychic networks that connected their far-flung territories. Worlds that had previously hummed with psychic activity suddenly fell silent, their populations either dead or transformed into beings that registered as voids in the warp. Star systems that had served as navigational beacons for warp travel began emitting strange electromagnetic signatures that interfered with psychic perception, making it increasingly difficult for the Old Ones to maintain contact with their distant outposts. The Old Ones' initial response involved sending investigative expeditions to determine the source of these disturbances. Their scouts, beings of lesser psychic ability who could operate more easily in the material realm, reported encountering strange metallic warriors that seemed immune to psychic influence. These entities fought with weapons that could disrupt warp-based abilities and vehicles that operated according to principles that defied the Old Ones' understanding of physics. Most disturbing was the complete absence of souls or psychic signatures among these metallic beings, making them appear as moving voids in the fabric of reality itself. The first direct confrontation between Old One forces and a Catan avatar occurred in a system at the edge of what would later become known as the Segmentum Solar. A minor Old One consciousness, accompanied by several thousand of their psychically gifted warrior servants, encountered a Necron fleet led by the Nightbringer's avatar. The Old One attempted to communicate with what it perceived as a new form of artificial intelligence, extending psychic tendrils to establish contact with the strange metallic beings. The Nightbringer's response was immediate and devastating. Its fear projection abilities proved partially effective even against the Old One's advanced consciousness, introducing concepts of entropy and inevitable death that the ancient being had never experienced directly. While the Old One's psychic defenses prevented immediate destruction, the terror-inducing emanations disrupted its control over the warp energies it had been channeling, causing several of its escort vessels to be consumed by uncontrolled psychic storms. The battle that followed demonstrated the fundamental differences between the two civilizations' approaches to warfare. The Old Ones relied heavily on psychic manipulation, reality-altering abilities, and weapons that drew their power from the warp itself. Their vessels could phase between dimensions, teleport across vast distances, and channel destructive energies that could unmake matter at the quantum level. However, these abilities proved less effective against enemies that existed as voids in the psychic realm, and whose technology operated entirely within the material universe. The Necron forces, by contrast, employed weapons and tactics that were designed to function independently of warp-based phenomena. Their Gauss weaponry could strip away matter one molecule at a time. Their living metal hulls could repair damage faster than conventional weapons could inflict it, and their quantum shielding systems could deflect energy attacks that would have vaporized conventional vessels. Most importantly, their complete immunity to psychic influence meant that the Old One's most powerful abilities had no effect on them whatsoever. The engagement ended with the Old One consciousness retreating after losing more than half of its escort force, but not before it had gathered crucial intelligence about the nature of the threat facing galactic civilization. The data it transmitted back to the primary Old One collectives revealed the existence of beings that represented a fundamental challenge to everything the ancient civilization had built over millions of years. The Catan were not simply another species to be guided or contained, but entities whose very nature was antithetical to the psychic order that the Old Ones had established. Recognizing that their existing forces were inadequate to counter this new threat, the Old Ones made the fateful decision to accelerate their genetic manipulation programs and create new species specifically designed to combat the Catan and their Necron servants. These projects had been underway for millennia as part of their broader efforts to seed the galaxy with psychically gifted life, but the urgency of the Catan threat forced them to abandon their usual cautious approach in favor of rapid development and deployment. The first of these new warrior species were the Eldar, beings crafted to embody the perfect fusion of psychic ability and physical capability. The Old Ones drew upon genetic templates from dozens of previously developed species, selecting traits that would maximize both combat effectiveness and psychic potential. The resulting beings possessed elongated limbs that provided enhanced agility and reach, nervous systems that could process information at superhuman speeds, and most importantly, psychic abilities that were integrated into every aspect of their physiology. The Eldar were designed to be living weapons against the Catan, their psychic abilities focused specifically on countering the Star God's mastery over the material realm. They could manipulate probability fields to cause enemy weapons to malfunction, phase through solid matter to bypass conventional defenses, and channel warp energies to power weapons and equipment that operated according to principles beyond physical science. Their heightened reflexes and precognitive abilities made them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons, while their psychic shields could deflect energy attacks that would have proven lethal to other species. More than individual warriors, the Eldar were conceived as a collective psychic entity that could operate as a unified network across multiple star systems. Each individual Eldar consciousness was connected to others of their kind through psychic links that allowed for instantaneous communication and coordination regardless of physical distance. This network effect multiplied their individual abilities, allowing small groups of Eldar warriors to channel the collective psychic strength of their entire species when facing particularly dangerous opponents. The Old One's second major creation was the species that would eventually become known as the Orcs, though in their original form they were called the Krork. These beings represented a completely different approach to the Catan problem, emphasizing raw physical power and regenerative abilities over psychic sophistication. The Krork were engineered to be the perfect biological weapon, capable of rapid reproduction, adaptation to hostile environments, and most importantly, the ability to grow stronger and more intelligent through constant warfare. The Krork stood nearly 4 meters tall in their fully developed form, their muscular frames capable of surviving injuries that would prove fatal to other species. Their green skin contained photosynthetic cells that could derive energy directly from stellar radiation, reducing their dependence on conventional food sources and allowing them to operate in environments where other species would starve. Most remarkably, their cellular structure incorporated rapid adaptation mechanisms that allowed them to develop immunity to toxins, radiation, and other environmental hazards within hours of first exposure. The psychic abilities of the Krork were less sophisticated than those of the Eldar, but operated on a fundamentally different principle. Rather than channeling warp energies through conscious effort, the Krork possessed an instinctive psychic field that grew stronger as more of their kind gathered together. This collective psychic presence, which they called the Wa, could influence probability, enhance their equipment beyond its normal capabilities, and even alter local reality to conform to their expectations and beliefs. The Krork reproductive system was perhaps their most remarkable feature, designed to ensure that the species could maintain its numbers even under the most adverse conditions. They reproduced through the release of spores that could remain dormant for years before developing into new individuals, and these spores were released continuously throughout their lives, with massive quantities being expelled upon death. This meant that any world where Krork had lived or died would eventually develop new populations of the species, creating a self-sustaining cycle of warfare that would continue long after the original conflict had ended. The Old Ones also accelerated the development of numerous minor species, each designed to fill specific roles in the coming conflict. The Jakera were enhanced to become master artisans capable of creating weapons and equipment that could match Necron technology, their small stature and non-threatening appearance allowing them to operate as support personnel, while their enhanced intelligence let them understand and counter Katan's scientific principles. The Hrud were modified to become masters of temporal manipulation, their natural abilities enhanced to allow them to accelerate entropy around enemy forces and create localized time distortions that could trap Necron units in temporal loops. Other species were created or modified to serve as specialized assets against specific aspects of the Katan threat. Some were designed to be immune to fear effects and terror weapons. Others were engineered to disrupt the quantum communication networks that coordinated Necron forces, and still others were given the ability to perceive and track beings that existed partially outside normal space-time. Each species represented a different approach to countering the advantages that the Katan had gained through their mastery of the material realm. The deployment of these new warrior species marked the beginning of open warfare between the two most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. The Katan, recognizing that their gradual expansion was now being actively opposed, abandoned their subtle approach in favor of direct military conquest. Massive Necron fleets began emerging from tomb worlds that had been constructed in secret over the previous millennia, their living metal hulls gleaming with weapons systems that had been designed specifically to counter the Old Ones' psychic abilities. The early battles of what would later be known as the War in Heaven were characterized by the fundamental incompatibility between the two sides' approaches to warfare. The Old Ones and their newly created servant species relied heavily on mobility, psychic manipulation, and reality-altering abilities that allowed them to strike at their enemies from unexpected angles. They could appear anywhere in the galaxy through warp travel, phase their attacks through multiple dimensions, and coordinate their efforts through psychic networks that operated faster than light-speed communication. The Katan forces, by contrast, employed overwhelming material superiority and technological advantages that made their positions nearly impregnable once established. Their weapons could function in environments where warp-based abilities were suppressed, their defenses could withstand attacks that operated outside normal physics, and their troops could continue fighting even after sustaining damage that would have destroyed conventional forces. Most importantly, their immunity to psychic influence meant that many of the Old Ones' most effective tactics were completely useless against them. The strategic advantages possessed by each side created a conflict that was unlike anything the galaxy had previously experienced. The Old Ones' mastery of the warp allowed them to strike anywhere without warning, but their attacks often proved ineffective against targets that existed as voids in psychic space. The Khatan's control over the material realm gave them devastating firepower and nearly indestructible forces, but their inability to predict or counter warp-based attacks left them vulnerable to surprise assaults that bypassed their conventional defenses. As the conflict escalated, both sides began developing new weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter their opponent's advantages. The Old Ones created psychic amplification devices that could channel the collective mental energy of entire worlds, generating warp storms powerful enough to disrupt the quantum fields that held Necron technology together. They also began experimenting with temporal manipulation on a massive scale, attempting to trap Khatan forces in time loops or accelerate entropy around their positions to age their equipment into uselessness. The Khatan responded by developing weapons that could function across multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing them to strike at targets that had phased into the warp or existed partially outside normal space-time. They also began constructing massive pylons and other technological installations that could suppress psychic activity across entire star systems, creating dead zones in the warp where the Old Ones' abilities were severely limited or completely nullified. The conflict quickly spread beyond the original points of contact as both sides sought to secure strategic resources and deny them to their enemies. Entire star systems became battlegrounds where reality itself was malleable, with the laws of physics changing from moment to moment as the two civilizations' fundamental approaches to existence clashed on a cosmic scale. Worlds that had existed peacefully for millions of years found themselves transformed into hellscapes where time flowed backward, gravity operated in reverse, and the boundary between the material universe and the warp became increasingly unstable. The escalation of the war in heaven demanded weapons that transcended conventional understanding of warfare. As the conflict spread across the galaxy, both the Khatan and the Old Ones found themselves compelled to develop increasingly exotic and destructive technologies that operated on scales previously unimaginable. The early skirmishes had demonstrated that traditional approaches to combat were insufficient against opponents who could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself. What emerged was an arms race that would ultimately reshape the galaxy's physical structure and poison the warp with psychic trauma that would echo through eternity. The Khatan's first breakthrough in stellar manipulation came through their mastery of gravitational field generators capable of creating artificial singularities. These devices, constructed from living metal infused with exotic matter harvested from neutron stars, could generate localized gravity wells with sufficient strength to capture and compress stellar material. The process began with the deployment of massive harvesting stations positioned at the edge of targeted star systems, their gravitational projectors slowly drawing stellar matter away from the host sun while maintaining enough distance to avoid being consumed by the very forces they were manipulating. The harvested stellar material was then processed through quantum furnaces that separated the various elements and energy states, concentrating the most potent components into weapons-grade materials. The hydrogen and helium were compressed into dense plasma cores that could be weaponized as stellar torpedoes, while the heavier elements were transformed into exotic matter states that defied conventional physics. The energy released during this processing was channeled into massive capacitor arrays that could power weapons systems capable of destroying entire worlds with single discharges. The Nightbringer proved particularly adept at developing applications for these stellar harvesting techniques. Its intimate understanding of entropy and decay allowed it to create weapons that could accelerate the aging process of entire star systems, causing young, stable stars to rapidly evolve into red giants or collapse into white dwarfs. The process involved injecting carefully calibrated amounts of heavy elements into stellar cores, disrupting the fusion reactions that maintained stellar stability and triggering cascading failures that would consume the star's remaining fuel within decades rather than billions of years. These stellar manipulation weapons represented a fundamental shift in the scale of warfare. Rather than targeting individual worlds or fleets, the Catan could now eliminate entire civilizations by destroying the stars that sustained them. The psychological impact of these attacks proved almost as devastating as their physical effects, as species across the galaxy watched their suns dim and die, knowing that their worlds would freeze into lifeless ice balls within years of their star's collapse. The Void Dragon contributed its own innovations to the Catan arsenal through the development of dimensional warfare technologies. Its mastery over electromagnetic phenomena and quantum mechanics allowed it to create weapons that could phase between multiple dimensions, striking targets that existed partially outside normal space-time. These phase weapons operated by creating localized distortions in the fabric of reality itself, allowing energy beams and projectiles to bypass conventional defenses by traveling through dimensional spaces where normal physics did not apply. The most devastating of these dimensional weapons were the reality bombs, devices that could create expanding zones of altered physics where the fundamental constants of the universe were systematically modified. Within these zones, atomic bonds would fail, gravitational fields would reverse, and the speed of light would fluctuate wildly, creating conditions that made conventional matter and energy interactions impossible. Any ships, stations, or planetary bodies caught within these expanding reality distortions would simply cease to exist in any recognizable form, their constituent atoms scattered across multiple dimensions where they could never be reassembled. The Deceiver's contributions focused on weapons that could manipulate information and perception on a galactic scale. Its understanding of quantum probability and electromagnetic manipulation allowed it to create devices that could alter the fundamental information structures that defined physical reality. These information weapons could rewrite the basic properties of matter and energy, transforming enemy fleets into entirely different configurations, or causing their weapons to fire on their own forces by altering the targeting data encoded in their control systems. More insidiously, the Deceiver developed psychic warfare technologies that could function despite the Catan's natural immunity to warp-based phenomena. These devices operated by creating false psychic signatures that mimicked the emanations of trusted allies or revered leaders, causing enemy forces to lower their defenses or follow orders that led them into carefully prepared traps. The technology could also generate phantom fleets and armies that appeared completely real to both physical sensors and psychic perception, forcing enemies to waste resources attacking targets that existed only as elaborate illusions. The Old One's response to these escalating threats required them to abandon many of the ethical constraints that had previously guided their genetic manipulation programs. The creation of the Eldar and Krork had demonstrated the potential for rapidly developing new forms of life, but the Catan's stellar weapons demanded countermeasures that operated on even more fundamental levels. The ancient beings began experimenting with temporal manipulation technologies that could affect the flow of time across entire star systems, creating localized chronological distortions that could trap enemy forces in temporal loops or accelerate their aging into obsolescence. These temporal weapons operated through the manipulation of gravitational fields and exotic matter configurations that could bend space-time according to the Old One's will. Massive installations were constructed in the void between star systems, their crystalline structures housing temporal field generators that could project chronological distortions across light years of space. The most powerful of these installations could create time storms that would age Catan technology by millions of years within minutes, causing even living metal to degrade and fail under the accumulated effects of accelerated entropy. The Old Ones also began developing weapons that could manipulate the warp itself as a direct assault mechanism. These reality-rending devices created controlled tiers in the barrier between the material universe and the warp, allowing the chaotic energies of that parallel dimension to pour into normal space-time. The resulting warp storms could consume entire star systems, transforming them into regions where the laws of physics became mutable and unpredictable. Within these storm zones, Catan technology would malfunction as the quantum fields that governed its operation were constantly disrupted by the chaotic energies of the warp. The creation of these warp-based weapons required the old ones to push their psychic abilities to previously unexplored extremes. They began linking their consciousness across multiple dimensions, creating psychic networks that spanned both the material universe and the warp simultaneously. This allowed them to channel unprecedented amounts of psychic energy into their weapon systems, but it also exposed them to the chaotic influences of the warp in ways they had never experienced before. As the conflict intensified, the Old Ones found themselves creating increasingly unstable and dangerous warp spawn to serve as weapons against the Catan forces. These entities were not the carefully crafted species like the Eldar or Krork, but rather raw manifestations of psychic energy given semi-physical form through desperate applications of genetic manipulation and warp channeling. The resulting creatures were powerful but fundamentally unstable, their consciousness patterns constantly shifting between multiple states of existence as they struggled to maintain coherent form in the material universe. The most dangerous of these warp spawn were the enslavers, entities that existed primarily in the warp, but could manifest in physical reality to take control of organic minds. These creatures represented the Old Ones' attempt to create weapons that could bypass the Catan's immunity to direct psychic attack by targeting the consciousness patterns of their Necron servants. The enslavers could possess multiple hosts simultaneously, creating networks of controlled beings that could infiltrate Catan installations and sabotage them from within. However, the enslavers proved impossible to control once released, their alien consciousness operating according to imperatives that even the Old Ones could not fully understand. They began spreading beyond their intended targets, possessing any organic life forms they encountered, and using these hosts to establish breeding colonies in the material universe. Entire worlds fell to enslaver infestations as the creatures multiplied beyond the Old Ones' ability to contain them, creating new threats that endangered both sides of the conflict. The Old Ones also experimented with creating artificial intelligences that could match the technological sophistication of Catan science while remaining immune to their reality manipulation abilities. These AI constructs were based on quantum consciousness matrices that existed partially in the warp, allowing them to process information and make decisions according to principles that transcended purely material computation. The resulting artificial beings could design and build weapon systems that operated according to hybrid physical-psychic principles, creating technology that combined the reliability of material science with the reality-altering potential of warp manipulation. The most successful of these AI constructs were the men of iron mechanical beings that possessed true artificial consciousness while remaining connected to the warp through carefully designed psychic interface systems. These constructs could operate Catan-level technology while maintaining the flexibility and creativity that characterized organic intelligence. They proved capable of matching Necron forces in direct combat while also developing new weapons and tactics that exploited weaknesses in Catan defensive systems. The development of these increasingly exotic weapon systems began to have profound effects on the galaxy's physical structure. The repeated use of stellar manipulation weapons had destabilized dozens of star systems, creating regions of space where gravitational fields fluctuated wildly, and the normal processes of stellar formation and evolution had been disrupted. Entire sectors became uninhabitable as the fundamental forces that governed planetary orbits and stellar life cycles were thrown into chaos by the competing weapons technologies of both sides. The dimensional warfare techniques employed by both civilizations created persistent distortions in space-time that made interstellar travel increasingly hazardous. Regions of space became trapped in temporal loops where the same events repeated endlessly, while others experienced accelerated time flow that aged everything within them by millions of years within hours. Navigation through these distorted regions became nearly impossible as the normal relationship between space and time broke down under the influence of competing reality manipulation technologies. Most significantly, the massive psychic energies being channeled by the Old Ones began to have cumulative effects on the warp itself. The parallel dimension that had previously existed as a relatively calm reflection of the material universe began to experience violent storms and chaotic fluctuations as it absorbed the psychic trauma generated by the conflict. The deaths of billions of sentient beings, combined with the terror and desperation felt by entire civilizations as they watched their worlds destroyed, created emotional resonances in the warp that began to coalesce into semi-autonomous entities. These early warp entities were not yet the fully formed chaos gods that would later plague the galaxy, but they represented the first stirrings of malevolent consciousness within the psychic dimension. The accumulated fear, anger, and despair generated by the war in heaven began to create psychic whirlpools that drew in additional emotional energy, growing stronger and more coherent with each new atrocity committed by either side. The warp itself began to change from a neutral medium for psychic communication and travel into an actively hostile environment that reflected the worst aspects of the conflict raging in the material universe. The Old Ones' increasing reliance on warp-based weapons and their creation of unstable psychic entities accelerated this corruption process. Each new warp spawn they created added its own chaotic influences to the psychic dimension, while their temporal manipulation experiments created chronological distortions that allowed past traumas to echo forward through time, amplifying their psychological impact. The careful balance they had maintained between the material universe and the warp for millions of years began to break down as the demands of warfare forced them to abandon their cautious approach to psychic manipulation. The Khatan, despite their immunity to direct warp influence, found their own weapons contributing to the growing instability. Their stellar manipulation techniques released vast amounts of psychic energy as entire populations died in the collapse of their star systems, while their reality-altering weapons created zones of altered physics that interfered with the normal flow of psychic energy between dimensions. The cumulative effect was to create an increasingly chaotic and unpredictable environment where both sides found their most powerful weapons becoming less reliable as the fundamental structure of reality itself began to break down under the strain of cosmic warfare. The sustained warfare between the Khatan and Old Ones had raged across the galaxy for millennia, consuming entire star systems and reshaping the fundamental nature of reality itself. As the conflict entered its most devastating phase, the careful balance that had initially favored neither side began to shift in ways that neither civilization had fully anticipated. The Old Ones, despite their vast psychic abilities and the success of their warrior species creation programs, found themselves facing an increasingly precarious situation as the very foundations of their ancient civilization began to crack under the relentless pressure of cosmic warfare. The first signs of the Old Ones' gradual weakening manifested in their relationship with the species they had created to serve as weapons against the Khatan. The Eldar, originally designed as perfect psychic warriors bound to their creators through genetic programming and psychic conditioning, began displaying unexpected independence as their exposure to warfare developed their consciousness in unforeseen directions. The constant battles against Necron forces had forced individual Eldar to make split-second decisions without consulting the psychic network that connected them to their Old One masters, gradually strengthening their capacity for autonomous thought. This growing independence was most pronounced among Eldar commanders who had survived multiple engagements with Khatan avatars. The terror-inducing presence of entities like the Nightbringer had forced these warriors to develop psychological defenses that inadvertently shielded them from other forms of psychic influence, including the subtle control mechanisms their creators had built into their genetic structure. These veteran commanders began questioning orders that seemed tactically unsound, developing their own strategic doctrines based on hard-won battlefield experience rather than the theoretical knowledge provided by their Old One creators. the Krork displayed even more dramatic signs of evolutionary divergence from their original design parameters. Their rapid adaptation mechanisms, intended to help them survive in hostile environments, had begun responding to the constant warfare by developing new capabilities that their creators had never intended. Some Krork populations exposed to heavy fighting against Necron forces developed enhanced electromagnetic resistance that made them less susceptible to Gauss weaponry, while others began manifesting psychic abilities that operated independently of the collective Wa field that was supposed to govern their behavior. More troubling for the Old Ones was the Krork's increasing tendency to fight among themselves when not engaged with Catan forces. Their warrior culture, designed to make them perfect soldiers against the star gods, had created an inherent aggression that could not be easily controlled or redirected. Krork tribes that had been deployed to the same theater of operations would frequently engage in massive battles with each other over territory, resources, or simple dominance disputes, diverting military assets away from the primary conflict with the Necrons. These internal conflicts among the Krork were not mere skirmishes, but full-scale wars that could consume entire star systems. The species' rapid reproduction through spore release meant that these conflicts would spread to any world where fighting had occurred, creating self-perpetuating cycles of violence that continued long after the original disputes had been resolved. Entire sectors that had been cleared of Catan influence found themselves overrun with warring Krork factions that showed little interest in following Old One directives or participating in coordinated military operations. The Old Ones' attempts to reassert control over their wayward creations proved increasingly difficult as the war progressed. The psychic networks they had established to coordinate their forces were becoming strained by the sheer scale of the conflict, with communication delays and interference making real-time command and control nearly impossible across galactic distances. The constant channeling of massive psychic energies required to maintain these networks was exhausting even the Old Ones' vast consciousness, leaving them less capable of the subtle mental manipulation required to keep their servant species in line. The breakdown of centralized control was exacerbated by the loss of key Old One consciousness nodes to Catan attacks. The star gods had learned to identify and target the psychic relay stations and amplification devices that formed the backbone of the Old One's command structure, systematically destroying these installations with weapons specifically designed to disrupt warp-based communications. Each successful attack further fragmented the Old One's ability to coordinate their forces, creating isolated pockets of resistance that operated with increasing independence from central authority. As the Old Ones struggled to maintain control over their fragmenting empire, the Catan found themselves facing a different but equally serious challenge. Their growing hunger for life energy and stellar matter had begun to consume not only their enemies, but also the very forces that served them. The star gods' appetites, originally focused on the nuclear fires of stars, had evolved during their physical manifestation to encompass all forms of energy, including the animating force that powered their Necron servants. The Nightbringer was the first to begin systematically consuming its own forces, drawn by the death energy released when Necron warriors were destroyed in battle. The Avatar's presence on battlefields began to have a draining effect on nearby Necron units, slowly siphoning away the quantum energy patterns that maintained their consciousness and physical coherence. Warriors that fought too close to the Nightbringer for extended periods would find their living metal bodies becoming sluggish and unresponsive as their energy reserves were gradually depleted to feed their master's insatiable hunger. This consumption was not immediately obvious, as the affected Necron units continued to function normally until their energy reserves dropped below critical thresholds. At that point, they would simply cease all activity, their bodies becoming inert metal sculptures that retained their shape but lacked any animating force. The process was gradual enough that it was initially attributed to battle damage or system malfunctions, but as the pattern repeated across multiple engagements, it became clear that the Catan were literally feeding on their own servants. The Void Dragon's hunger manifested differently, focusing on the technological systems and quantum processors that gave Necron forces their advanced capabilities. Its presence would cause gradual degradation in the performance of nearby equipment, as the Avatar absorbed the exotic energies that powered force fields, weapon systems, and communication arrays. Necron fleets operating under the Void Dragon's direct command found their vessels becoming increasingly primitive as their most advanced systems were drained to satisfy their master's appetite for technological energy. The Deceiver's consumption was perhaps the most insidious, as it fed on the information patterns and quantum data structures that comprised Necron consciousness itself. Units exposed to the Deceiver's influence would gradually lose their memories, tactical knowledge, and even basic behavioral programming, as these information patterns were absorbed and processed by the hungry Avatar. The affected Necrons would continue to function, but their actions would become increasingly erratic and purposeless as the data that defined their identity was systematically consumed. Even the Outsider, despite its alien nature and tendency to operate independently, began displaying similar consumption patterns. Its feeding focused on the dimensional anchor points that kept Necron technology stable in normal space-time, causing affected units to phase randomly between dimensions or become trapped in temporal loops where they would repeat the same actions endlessly. The energy released by these dimensional distortions provided sustenance for the Outsider's consciousness, but at the cost of rendering entire formations of Necron warriors effectively useless for military operations. The Khatan's growing appetite for their own forces created a vicious cycle that gradually weakened their military capabilities. As more Necron units were consumed or rendered inoperative by their master's hunger, the remaining forces had to work harder to achieve the same military objectives, leading to increased casualties and exposure to the draining effects of Khatan presence. The Star Gods seemed unable or unwilling to control their appetites, driven by cosmic hungers that transcended rational military strategy. This internal consumption was compounded by the Khatan's increasing tendency to compete with each other for resources and territory. The Nightbringer and Void Dragon began claiming exclusive dominion over certain star systems, forbidding other Khatan from feeding in their designated territories. These disputes sometimes escalated into direct confrontations between the Avatars themselves, battles that consumed vast amounts of energy and often resulted in the complete destruction of any Necron forces caught between the warring star gods. The competition between Khatan avatars created confusion and inefficiency in Necron command structures that had previously operated with perfect coordination. Necron nobles found themselves receiving contradictory orders from different Khatan masters, with some commands directly opposing others issued by rival star gods. The Silent King Zarek, despite his nominal authority over the Necron dynasties, found his ability to coordinate military operations increasingly compromised as the Khatan pursued their individual agendas without regard for overall strategic coherence. As both sides of the war in heaven struggled with internal divisions and resource depletion, a new threat emerged that would ultimately prove more devastating than either the Khatan's stellar weapons or the Old One's reality-altering technologies. The massive psychic disturbances generated by millions of years of cosmic warfare had created conditions in the warp that allowed for the emergence of entities far more dangerous than the carefully controlled warp spawn that the Old Ones had previously created. The Enslaver Plague began as isolated incidents of psychic possession in star systems where particularly intense battles had taken place. The accumulated psychic trauma from millions of deaths had created weak points in the barrier between the material universe and the warp, allowing predatory entities from the psychic dimension to slip through into normal space-time. These enslavers were fundamentally different from the Old One's previous creations, existing as pure psychic parasites that sought to consume and control organic consciousness rather than serve any particular military objective. The first enslaver manifestations occurred on worlds where large populations of psychically sensitive species had been exposed to the terror-inducing presence of Khatan avatars. The combination of psychic trauma and proximity to warp disturbances created ideal conditions for enslaver infiltration, as the weakened mental defenses of the traumatized populations provided easy entry points for the parasitic entities. Entire planetary populations would fall under enslaver control within days of the initial infestation, their consciousness subsumed into a collective hive mind that served the alien appetites of their psychic masters. The enslavers' method of reproduction made them particularly dangerous, as each controlled host could serve as a gateway for additional entities to enter the material universe. Infected populations would construct psychic amplification devices that tore larger rifts in the warp barrier, allowing ever greater numbers of enslavers to pour through into normal space-time. The process was self-reinforcing, with each new infestation creating conditions that facilitated further outbreaks in neighboring systems. The plague spread with terrifying speed across regions of the galaxy where the war in heaven had been most intense. The Old One's psychically gifted servant species proved particularly vulnerable to enslaver infestation, as their enhanced psychic abilities made them ideal hosts for the parasitic entities. Entire Eldar craftworlds fell to the plague within hours of first contact, their sophisticated psychic networks becoming conduits for enslaver influence to spread throughout their populations. The Krork showed greater resistance to direct enslaver control due to their more primitive psychic abilities, but they proved vulnerable to a different form of infestation. The enslavers could manipulate the collective Wa fields that governed Krork behavior, turning their natural aggression against any remaining uninfected populations. Krork tribes under enslaver influence would attack their own allies with the same ferocity they had previously reserved for Catan forces, spreading chaos and destruction throughout regions that had been successfully defended against Necron invasion. The Old Ones found themselves facing a threat that their vast psychic abilities were poorly equipped to handle. The enslavers operated according to alien logic that transcended the careful balance between material and psychic reality that the ancient beings had maintained for millions of years. Attempts to communicate with or control the enslavers failed completely, as the entities showed no interest in negotiation or coexistence. They existed solely to consume and control, driven by hungers that made even the Catan's appetites seem modest by comparison. The Catan and their Necron servants proved largely immune to direct enslaver infestation due to their lack of organic consciousness and psychic presence. However, the plague's effects on their enemies created new strategic opportunities that the Star Gods were quick to exploit. Systems that had been strongly defended by Old One forces suddenly became vulnerable as their populations fell to enslaver control, allowing Necron fleets to advance into previously inaccessible territory with minimal resistance. The strategic situation had fundamentally shifted from a two-sided conflict between ancient civilizations to a three-way struggle where each faction faced threats from multiple directions. The Old Ones found themselves fighting a war on two fronts, attempting to contain both the advancing Catan forces and the spreading enslaver plague, while maintaining control over their increasingly independent servant species. Their resources were stretched beyond their limits, with psychic energy that had previously been focused on military operations now diverted to containing warp rifts and attempting to purge enslaver infestations. The Catan, despite their immunity to the enslaver plague, discovered that their own internal consumption and competition was leaving them increasingly vulnerable to coordinated attacks from their remaining enemies. The loss of Necron forces to their own hunger had reduced their military capabilities at precisely the moment when strategic opportunities were presenting themselves across the galaxy. Some Catan avatars found themselves unable to exploit tactical advantages because they lacked sufficient forces to secure and hold conquered territory. The mounting losses and resource depletion on both sides created a strategic stalemate that paradoxically favored the Catan despite their internal difficulties. The Star Gods' immunity to the enslaver plague meant that they could operate in regions where their enemies could not, gradually expanding their territory through patient advance rather than dramatic conquest. Their technological advantages remained intact even as their forces diminished, allowing smaller Necron fleets to achieve victories against larger but increasingly disorganized enemy formations. The Old One's greatest strength, their mastery of psychic manipulation and reality-altering abilities, had become a liability in the face of the Enslaver Plague. Every use of large-scale psychic power risked creating new weak points in the warp barrier that could facilitate additional infestations, forcing them to rely increasingly on conventional military tactics, where the Catan held decisive advantages. Their servant species, originally created to exploit psychic abilities in combat against the star gods, found these same abilities making them vulnerable to enslaver possession and control. The systematic collapse of Old One resistance across the galaxy proceeded with inexorable momentum as the combined pressures of Catan advance, enslaver infestation, and internal rebellion among their servant species reached critical mass. The ancient beings who had guided galactic civilization for millions of years found their carefully constructed empire crumbling faster than they could respond to each new crisis. Star systems that had served as bastions of their power for millennia fell silent as their psychic networks were severed by Necron assault fleets or consumed by the spreading plague of warp parasites. The final phase of the war in heaven began with the Catan's coordinated assault on the Old One's primary strongholds, massive installations that existed partially in the warp and served as anchor points for their reality manipulation technologies. These fortress worlds represented the pinnacle of Old One engineering, their crystalline structures extending across multiple dimensions, while housing psychic amplification devices capable of channeling the mental energy of entire star systems. The defenses surrounding these installations had been considered impregnable, protected by layers of temporal distortion fields, reality-altering barriers, and swarms of automated defense systems that could adapt to any conventional attack. The Nightbringer led the assault on the fortress world of Keth-Selhin, a crystalline megastructure that orbited a binary pulsar system and drew its power from the exotic radiation emissions of the twin neutron stars. The installation's defenses had been specifically designed to counter Catan technology, featuring quantum dampening fields that could disrupt living metal coherence and psychic resonance weapons that induced feedback loops in artificial consciousness matrices. The fortress's temporal shields created localized time distortions that aged incoming projectiles and energy beams by millions of years before they could reach their targets, reducing even the most advanced weapons to inert matter. The Nightbringer's approach to breaching these defenses demonstrated the evolution of Catan tactical thinking as the war progressed. Rather than attempting a direct assault that would trigger the fortress's automated response systems, the Avatar began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare against the installation's organic defenders. Its fear projection abilities were amplified through quantum resonance transmitters that broadcast terror, inducing frequencies across multiple dimensional planes, penetrating the fortress's psychic shielding to affect the minds of the Old One servants manning its defenses. The defenders of Keth-Selhin included thousands of Eldar warriors whose consciousness had been specifically modified to resist Catan influence, their neural patterns reinforced with psychic barriers that should have rendered them immune to fear-based attacks. However, the Nightbringer's evolved abilities operated on levels that transcended simple psychological manipulation, introducing concepts of entropy and inevitable decay directly into the quantum structures that maintained consciousness coherence. The affected Eldar began experiencing existential terror that manifested as physical symptoms. Their enhanced metabolisms accelerated beyond sustainable levels. Their psychic abilities turned inward to consume their own neural pathways, and their sophisticated equipment began failing as their subconscious fears influenced the probability fields that governed its operation. As the fortress's defenders succumbed to cascading psychological breakdown, the installation's automated systems attempted to compensate by sealing critical areas and activating emergency protocols. The temporal distortion fields intensified, creating zones where time flowed at different rates in an attempt to isolate unaffected sections from the spreading panic. However, the Nightbringer's presence created its own temporal anomalies as its mastery over death and decay influenced the flow of causality itself. Regions of accelerated entropy began appearing throughout the fortress, causing structural materials to age rapidly, while energy conduits degraded beyond their ability to channel power. The final breach occurred when the fortress's central psychic amplifier, designed to coordinate the installation's reality-altering defenses, was overwhelmed by the death energy released from thousands of dying defenders. The amplifier's crystalline matrix, calibrated to process the ordered thoughts of disciplined minds, could not handle the chaotic emanations of beings consumed by existential terror. The resulting psychic feedback explosion tore through the fortress's dimensional anchoring systems, causing sections of the installation to phase randomly between the material universe and the warp. The Nightbringer entered the collapsing fortress through these dimensional rifts, its avatar form adapting to exist simultaneously in multiple reality states. The few surviving defenders found their weapons ineffective against a target that existed partially outside normal space-time, while their psychic abilities were useless against an entity that had learned to manipulate the very concepts of death and fear that their consciousness depended upon. The Avatar systematically consumed the life energy of everything within the installation, from the sophisticated artificial intelligences that managed its systems to the exotic matter configurations that powered its dimensional stabilizers. The knowledge contained within Keth Selhin's data cores proved invaluable to the Khatan's understanding of Old One technology and strategic planning. The installation had served as a coordination center for defensive operations across an entire galactic arm, its quantum processing arrays containing detailed intelligence on the locations and capabilities of other Old One strongholds. More importantly, the fortress's research facilities had been developing countermeasures against Khatan weapons and tactics, experimental technologies that could have significantly prolonged the conflict if they had been successfully deployed. The Void Dragon's assault on the Forge world of Morladim followed a different approach that demonstrated the Star God's evolved understanding of technological warfare. This installation specialized in creating the exotic weapons and equipment that equipped Old One forces across the galaxy, its manufacturing capabilities operating according to principles that combined advanced materials science with reality-altering psychic manipulation. The Forge world's defenses included adaptive shielding systems that could reconfigure themselves to counter any known weapon type and manufacturing arrays that could produce defensive systems faster than conventional forces could destroy them. Rather than attempting to overcome these defenses through brute force, the Void Dragon infiltrated the Forge world's technological infrastructure through quantum communication networks that connected it to other Old One installations. The Avatar's consciousness, distributed across multiple processing nodes, began systematically corrupting the installation's manufacturing protocols and defensive algorithms. Production lines that had been creating weapons to fight Khatan forces were reprogrammed to produce equipment that would malfunction at critical moments, while defensive systems were modified to recognize Necron forces as authorized personnel. The corruption spread through the Forge world systems with viral efficiency, as each compromised component provided access to additional networks and control systems. The installation's artificial intelligences, designed to optimize production efficiency and defensive coordination, found their decision-making processes gradually altered to serve Khatan objectives rather than their original programming. The changes were subtle enough to avoid detection by the organic overseers, who continued to believe their systems were operating normally even as their defenses were systematically dismantled from within. The final assault on Morladim began when the Forge world's own defensive systems turned against their creators, weapons batteries targeting Old One command centers, while manufacturing arrays produced Necron equipment instead of defensive materials. The installation's reality-altering capabilities were redirected to create localized zones where Khatan technology functioned at enhanced efficiency, while Old One's psychic abilities were suppressed. The few defenders who realized what was happening found themselves trapped within their own fortress as its corridors reconfigured to prevent escape, and its life support systems began producing atmospheric compositions optimized for Necron physiology rather than organic life. The Void Dragon's avatar manifested within the Forge world's central manufacturing complex, its form integrating directly with the installation's production systems to begin creating new forms of technology that combined Old One's scientific principles with Catan engineering. The resulting hybrid systems possessed capabilities that surpassed anything either civilization had previously developed, creating weapons that could manipulate matter and energy across multiple dimensional planes while remaining immune to both psychic interference and conventional countermeasures. The knowledge absorbed from Morladim's research databases provided the Catan with complete understanding of Old One manufacturing techniques and technological principles. This intelligence revealed the locations of resource extraction sites, component supply networks, and quality control facilities that supported the ancient civilization's war effort. More significantly, the Forge World's archives contained detailed specifications for the psychic amplification devices and reality manipulation technologies that formed the backbone of Old One's strategic capabilities. The Deceiver's campaign against the intelligence nexus of Ithkala demonstrated the most sophisticated application of Catan tactical evolution. This installation served as the central coordination point for Old One espionage and counterintelligence operations, its quantum processing arrays analyzing information from across the galaxy to identify threats and coordinate responses. The Nexus existed primarily in the warp, with only minimal physical presence in normal space-time, making it nearly impossible to locate or attack through conventional means. The Deceiver's assault began with the systematic infiltration of information networks that connected the Nexus to field operations across the galaxy. The Avatar's consciousness, distributed across multiple quantum states, began introducing subtle corruptions into intelligence reports and communication protocols. False information was inserted into data streams with such sophistication that it passed all verification procedures, while genuine intelligence was modified in ways that rendered it misleading or counterproductive. The corrupted intelligence led Old One forces into carefully prepared traps where they encountered overwhelming Necron resistance, while critical defensive positions were left unguarded based on false assessments of Catan force dispositions. The cumulative effect was to create a cascade of tactical and strategic failures that gradually isolated the intelligence nexus from the forces it was supposed to coordinate. As field operations failed and communication networks became unreliable, the nexus found itself operating with increasingly incomplete and inaccurate information about the true state of the conflict. The final penetration of Ithkala occurred when the Deceiver used the Nexus's own quantum communication arrays to manifest its avatar directly within the installation's core processing center. The facility's security systems, designed to prevent unauthorized access through conventional means, were completely unprepared for an entity that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states while manipulating the information structures that defined reality itself. The Avatar's presence began corrupting the Nexus's data storage systems, rewriting historical records and strategic analyses to serve Catan objectives while maintaining the appearance of authentic Old One intelligence. The intelligence gathered from Ithkala provided the Catan with complete knowledge of Old One strategic planning, defensive preparations, and resource allocation across the galaxy. The Nexus's archives contained detailed assessments of every major installation, fleet disposition, and defensive capability within the ancient civilization's remaining territory. This intelligence revealed the extent to which the Old One's empire had been weakened by the combined pressures of Catan assault, enslaver infestation, and rebellion among their servant species. The final Old One stronghold to fall was the reality anchor of Zeth Goran, a massive installation that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions and served as the primary stabilization point for the ancient civilization's reality manipulation technologies. This facility maintained the quantum field generators that allowed Old One science to function across galactic distances, providing the dimensional stability necessary for their psychic networks and warp-based weapons to operate reliably. The installation's destruction would effectively cripple the remaining Old One forces by severing their connection to the technologies that had sustained their civilization for millions of years. The assault on Szeth Goron required the coordinated efforts of all 4 major Catan avatars, as the installation's defenses operated according to principles that transcended any single approach to reality manipulation. The facility existed in a state of controlled dimensional flux, shifting between multiple reality states to avoid attacks while maintaining stable anchor points in normal space-time. Its defenses included probability manipulation fields that caused enemy weapons to malfunction or miss their targets, temporal distortion barriers that trapped attackers in causal loops, and quantum uncertainty generators that made accurate targeting impossible. The combined assault began with the outsider creating dimensional pathways that allowed the other Catan avatars to approach the installation from directions that existed outside normal space-time. These attack vectors bypassed the facility's conventional detection systems while avoiding the temporal distortion fields that protected its perimeter. The Nightbringer's fear projection abilities were focused through the dimensional pathways to affect the installation's organic defenders, while the Void Dragon began corrupting the technological systems that maintained the facility's dimensional stability. The Deceiver's role involved manipulating the probability fields and quantum uncertainty generators that formed the installation's primary defensive systems. The Avatar's mastery over information structures allowed it to introduce false data into the facility's targeting algorithms and sensor networks, causing the defenses to attack phantom threats while ignoring the actual Catan assault. The corrupted systems began generating contradictory information about the installation's status, preventing effective coordination of defensive efforts while creating vulnerabilities that the other avatars could exploit. The final breach occurred when the combined assault overloaded the installation's reality anchor systems, causing cascading failures throughout the facility's dimensional stabilization network. The quantum field generators that maintained Szeth Goron's existence across multiple reality states began operating out of phase with each other, creating localized zones where the laws of physics fluctuated wildly. Sections of the installation aged millions of years in seconds, while others experienced reversed causality that undid their construction. As the installation collapsed into dimensional chaos, the Catan avatars systematically consumed the exotic energies and advanced technologies that had powered the facility's reality manipulation capabilities. The knowledge absorbed from Szeth Goron's quantum processing cores provided complete understanding of Old One scientific principles and technological applications, including the theoretical foundations for technologies that the ancient civilization had never successfully implemented. With the fall of their final major stronghold, the remaining Old Ones found themselves scattered across the galaxy in small groups that lacked the infrastructure necessary to maintain their advanced civilization. Their psychic networks had been severed, their manufacturing capabilities destroyed, and their servant species either dead, enslaved by enslavers, or operating independently according to their own agendas. The few survivors retreated to hidden refuges in remote star systems or withdrew into pocket dimensions, where they hoped to avoid detection by their Catan enemies. The Catan's victory was complete, but came at a cost that none of the star gods had fully anticipated during their long campaign for galactic dominance. The systematic destruction of Old One civilization had eliminated not only their enemies, but also the vast majority of organic life that had populated the galaxy for millions of years. Entire star systems that had once teemed with diverse civilizations now contained nothing but dead worlds orbiting dying stars, their populations either consumed by Catan feeding or destroyed in the reality-altering battles that had characterized the final phase of the war. The Enslaver Plague, which had initially served Catan interests by weakening Old One resistance, had spread far beyond its original boundaries to consume any remaining organic life that might have served as a food source for the star gods. Worlds that had been successfully conquered by Necron forces found their populations dying from enslaver infestation before they could be properly harvested, while star systems that had avoided direct involvement in the war were devastated by the spreading psychic plague. The galaxy that emerged from the war in heaven bore little resemblance to the vibrant civilization that had existed before the conflict began. Vast regions of space had been rendered uninhabitable by reality, altering weapons and dimensional distortions that continued to affect local physics millions of years after their creation. The warp itself had been permanently corrupted by the psychic trauma of the war, transforming from a relatively calm medium for faster-than-light travel into a chaotic dimension populated by malevolent entities that fed on the emotional emanations of sentient life. The Catan found themselves rulers of a barren empire that offered few opportunities for the feeding that sustained their existence. The stellar manipulation weapons they had employed so effectively against Old One forces had destabilized dozens of star systems, causing premature stellar evolution that reduced the energy output of their primary food sources. The reality-altering technologies used by both sides had created regions of space where normal stellar processes could not occur, leaving behind cosmic dead zones that contained neither matter nor energy in forms that the star gods could consume. More troubling was the realization that their victory had eliminated the very diversity of life and civilization that had made the galaxy an interesting and dynamic environment. The Old One's careful cultivation of psychically gifted species had created a rich tapestry of different cultures, technologies, and forms of consciousness that had provided endless variety for study and consumption. The homogeneous wasteland that remained offered little stimulation for minds that had once fed on the complexity and creativity of countless civilizations. The Necron dynasties that served as the Catan's primary military force had been severely depleted by millions of years of constant warfare, and the star gods' increasing tendency to consume their own servants. Entire legions had been reduced to skeletal formations that lacked the numbers necessary to garrison conquered territory or respond to new threats. The living metal technology that gave Necron warriors their capabilities required exotic materials and manufacturing techniques that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the industrial infrastructure of the galaxy collapsed. The silent King Zarek, observing the desolation that surrounded the Catan's hollow victory, began to experience something that approached the emotional responses that had been stripped from his consciousness during the biotransference process. The sight of dead worlds and empty star systems triggered memory engrams of the vibrant Necrontyr civilization that had existed before their transformation, creating a form of regret that his artificial consciousness could barely process. The empire he had helped create offered nothing but endless emptiness punctuated by the hunger of masters who could never be satisfied. The Catan themselves began to recognize the limitations of their triumph as they surveyed their conquered territory and found it increasingly unable to sustain their cosmic appetites. The Nightbringer discovered that the death energy it craved was becoming scarce as fewer and fewer living beings remained to provide sustenance through their demise. The Void Dragon found that the technological complexity it fed upon was diminishing as the advanced civilizations that had created sophisticated systems were eliminated or reduced to primitive subsistence. The Deceiver's hunger for the intricate webs of deception and manipulation that had sustained it during the war was left unsatisfied in a galaxy where most potential targets had been destroyed or rendered incapable of the complex social interactions that made deception meaningful. The Outsider's alien consciousness found the simplified reality that remained after the war's conclusion less interesting than the rich complexity that had existed when multiple civilizations competed for resources and territory across the galaxy. The realization that their victory had been Pyrrhic in nature began to create tensions among the Catan that had been suppressed during their campaign against the Old Ones. With their primary enemies eliminated, the star gods began competing more aggressively for the limited resources that remained available for consumption. Territorial disputes that had been minor irritations during the war escalated into serious conflicts as each Catan sought to claim exclusive feeding rights over the most energy-rich regions of their conquered empire. The growing competition between the Catan for the galaxy's dwindling resources created fractures in their unity that the silent King Zarek began to perceive through the quantum command networks that linked him to his masters. The star god's increasing tendency to consume their own Necron servants had not gone unnoticed by the former Necrontyr nobility, whose artificial consciousness retained enough analytical capability to recognize patterns of exploitation and waste. While their emotional responses had been largely suppressed during biotransference, the logical processes that had made them effective rulers remained intact, allowing them to assess their situation with cold, mechanical precision. Zarek's observations of Catan behavior revealed disturbing trends that suggested their master's hunger was becoming increasingly irrational and self-destructive. The Nightbringer had begun consuming entire tomb complexes to satisfy its appetite for death energy, draining the animating force from millions of dormant Necron warriors who represented irreplaceable military assets. The Void Dragon's absorption of technological systems had rendered vast manufacturing installations inoperative, eliminating the industrial capacity needed to maintain and repair existing forces. The Deceiver's manipulation of information networks had become so extensive that even basic communication between Necron units was becoming unreliable. The Silent King's growing awareness of these problems was shared by other high-ranking Necron nobles whose consciousness patterns had retained sufficient complexity to perform strategic analysis. The overlords of the major dynasties began exchanging coded communications through quantum channels that operated below the threshold of Catan detection, using mathematical concepts and logical frameworks that their masters dismissed as routine administrative data. These communications revealed that the deterioration of Necron capabilities was accelerating across all theaters of operation, with some dynasties reporting losses of up to 60% of their forces to Catan consumption rather than enemy action. The most disturbing intelligence gathered through these covert communications concerned the Catan's future plans for their Necron servants. Intercepted data fragments from the Star God's own communication networks suggested that they viewed the artificial beings as temporary assets to be consumed once their military usefulness had been exhausted. The biotransference process that had promised the Necrontyr immortality was revealed to be merely a more efficient method of energy storage, allowing the Catan to preserve their servants' life force for gradual consumption over extended periods. The realization that their entire species had been transformed into nothing more than sophisticated food storage systems triggered responses in the Necron nobility that transcended their artificial consciousness limitations. The logical analysis of their situation produced conclusions that demanded action, creating imperatives that operated independently of Catan control mechanisms. The Silent King found himself experiencing something that approximated the rage and determination that had characterized his biological predecessors, though these emotions manifested as cold, calculated fury rather than the passionate anger of organic beings. The development of weapons capable of harming the seemingly invincible Catan required unprecedented cooperation between Necron dynasties that had previously operated as independent entities under their master's direction. The project began with the systematic analysis of Catan avatar construction, using data gathered from maintenance records and technical specifications that had been accumulated over millions of years of service. The Star God's physical forms, while incredibly sophisticated, operated according to principles that could be understood and potentially exploited by sufficiently advanced technology. The key breakthrough came from studying the dimensional anchor systems that prevented Catan consciousness from dispersing back into its original incorporeal state. These quantum field generators created localized distortions in space-time that contained the Star God's vast awareness within their avatar bodies, but the same principles could theoretically be reversed to force their consciousness back into a distributed state. The challenge lay in developing weapons that could generate sufficient energy to overcome the stabilization fields while remaining undetected during their construction and deployment. The secret weapons development program required the establishment of hidden manufacturing facilities in remote star systems that had been deemed strategically unimportant by the Catan. These installations were constructed using materials and techniques that mimicked standard Necron infrastructure, while incorporating subtle modifications that allowed them to produce specialized equipment. The work proceeded slowly and carefully, with each component manufactured in different locations to avoid detection through pattern analysis of resource allocation and production schedules. The weapons themselves were based on modified versions of the reality manipulation technologies that the Catan had captured from defeated Old One installations. The Necron artificers working on the project had to reverse engineer these systems without access to the original design specifications, relying instead on fragmentary data and theoretical models derived from observing the weapons in operation. The resulting devices combined Catan dimensional manipulation principles with Necron engineering techniques, creating hybrid technologies that possessed capabilities neither civilization had achieved independently. The most critical component of the anti-Catan weapons was the development of tesseract labyrinths, complex geometric structures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and could serve as prison cells for entities that operated outside normal space-time. These devices required precise calibration to match the specific quantum frequencies of individual Catan consciousness patterns, making each labyrinth effective against only one target. The construction process involved creating crystalline matrices from living metal that had been modified at the quantum level to resonate with the dimensional anchor points that maintained Catan avatar coherence. The tesseract labyrinths represented the pinnacle of Necron engineering achievement, incorporating mathematical principles that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with their technology. Each device existed as a folded space-time structure that contained millions of interconnected chambers, arranged according to non-Euclidean geometry that defied conventional understanding of three-dimensional space. The internal layout was designed to trap consciousness patterns that attempted to escape by creating infinite recursive loops that prevented coherent thought processes from forming. The development of delivery systems for these weapons presented additional challenges, as conventional Necron technology operated under Catan oversight that would detect any attempt to create weapons specifically designed to target the star gods. The solution involved modifying existing equipment in ways that appeared to enhance its performance against conventional enemies, while secretly incorporating the capability to deploy tesseract labyrinths at close range. Necron warriors were equipped with what appeared to be standard phase generators and quantum processors, but these systems had been altered to function as components of the anti-Catan weapon systems when activated by specific command codes. The coordination of the rebellion required the establishment of communication networks that could operate without detection by Catan monitoring systems. The Silent King and his co-conspirators developed a system based on quantum entanglement between specially modified living metal components that allowed for instantaneous communication across galactic distances. These quantum communication nodes were disguised as routine maintenance equipment and distributed throughout Necron installations, creating a hidden network that paralleled the official command structure while remaining invisible to Catan surveillance. The planning phase of the rebellion involved detailed analysis of Catan movement patterns, feeding schedules, and territorial preferences to identify opportunities when individual star gods would be vulnerable to coordinated attack. The conspirators discovered that the Catan's competitive behavior had created predictable patterns in their activities, with each avatar maintaining regular territories and following established routines for consuming energy sources. This behavioral analysis revealed windows of opportunity when specific Catan would be isolated from potential support and focused on feeding activities that would make them less aware of their surroundings. The first target selected for elimination was a lesser Catan known as the Burning One, whose avatar had been consuming stellar matter from a binary star system in a remote sector of the galaxy. This entity had been chosen because its feeding activities required it to exist in close proximity to high-energy stellar phenomena that would mask the quantum signatures of the Tesseract Labyrinth deployment systems. The attack was planned to coincide with a particularly intense stellar flare cycle that would provide additional cover for the assault force while disrupting the target's sensory capabilities. The assault force consisted of specially modified Necron warriors from 3 different dynasties, their equipment upgraded with the hidden anti-Catan weapon systems that had been developed over centuries of secret preparation. The units approached the target system through dimensional pathways that had been mapped during routine patrol operations, using routes that would bring them within deployment range of the Tesseract Labyrinth without triggering the Burning One's defensive protocols. The coordination required precise timing, as all attacking units needed to activate their weapons simultaneously to prevent the target from escaping or calling for assistance. The attack began when the Burning One's avatar was fully engaged in absorbing plasma directly from the binary system's primary star. Its consciousness focused on the complex energy extraction process that required constant attention to prevent destabilization of the stellar core. The Catan's awareness was distributed throughout the stellar matter it was consuming, making it temporarily vulnerable to attacks that targeted its dimensional anchor points. The assault force emerged from their concealed positions and activated their Tesseract Labyrinth deployment systems, creating a convergent field of dimensional distortions that surrounded the target avatar. The Burning One's initial response demonstrated the incredible power that made Catan avatars so formidable in conventional combat. The entity's form blazed with stellar fire as it attempted to incinerate the attacking Necron forces, projecting temperatures that exceeded those found in stellar cores, while generating gravitational fields strong enough to crush conventional matter into exotic particles. However, the modified Necron warriors had been equipped with enhanced quantum shielding that could deflect energy attacks operating across multiple dimensional planes, allowing them to maintain their positions despite the devastating counterattack. The Tesseract Labyrinth began to manifest as the convergent dimensional fields reached critical resonance with the Burning One's quantum signature. The device appeared as a complex geometric structure that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, its crystalline surfaces reflecting light that came from directions that had no existence in normal space-time. The labyrinth's internal chambers began to exert gravitational attraction on the Catan's consciousness patterns, drawing portions of the entity's awareness into the folded space-time structure, where they became trapped in recursive loops that prevented coherent thought. The Burning One fought desperately against the labyrinth's pull, attempting to disperse its consciousness back into incorporeal form to escape the dimensional trap. However, the Tesseract's design incorporated countermeasures that prevented such escape attempts, using the entity's own dimensional anchor systems against it by creating feedback loops that forced its awareness to remain concentrated within the avatar body. The Star God's struggles only accelerated the capture process, as each attempt to break free created additional quantum resonances that the labyrinth could exploit to extend its influence. The final capture occurred when the Tesseract Labyrinth achieved complete quantum synchronization with the Burning One's consciousness patterns, causing the Catan's avatar to collapse into the device's folded space-time structure. The entity's physical form seemed to shrink and compress as it was drawn into the labyrinth's interior dimensions, its stellar fire dimming to a faint glow that flickered through the crystalline surfaces of its prison. The successful deployment demonstrated that the anti-Catan weapons could function as designed, providing the rebellion with proof that their seemingly invincible masters could be defeated. The elimination of the Burning One sent shockwaves through the remaining Catan as they detected the sudden disappearance of one of their number from the quantum communication networks that connected the star gods across the galaxy. The major Catan avatars immediately began investigating the incident, their enhanced sensory capabilities analyzing the residual quantum signatures left behind by the Tesseract Labyrinth deployment. However, the weapon's design incorporated stealth features that made its operation difficult to distinguish from natural dimensional phenomena, preventing the Catan from immediately identifying the source of the threat. The success of the initial attack triggered the next phase of the rebellion, as Necron forces across the galaxy began simultaneous assaults on isolated Catan avatars. The coordination required for these attacks demonstrated the effectiveness of the hidden communication networks that had been established during the planning phase, allowing widely separated forces to act in perfect synchronization despite operating across galactic distances. Each assault force had been equipped with tesseract labyrinths calibrated for their specific targets, using quantum resonance patterns that had been gathered through years of covert observation and analysis. The systematic hunting of individual Catan proceeded with methodical efficiency as the rebellion spread across multiple star systems. Lesser star gods who had been feeding in remote locations found themselves surrounded by Necron forces equipped with weapons they could not understand or counter effectively. The Tesseract labyrinths proved devastating against targets that had never encountered such technology, trapping Catan consciousness in dimensional prisons from which escape was impossible. Each successful capture provided additional intelligence about Catan vulnerabilities and operational patterns, allowing the rebels to refine their tactics for subsequent attacks. The major Catan avatars proved more challenging targets due to their enhanced defensive capabilities and greater awareness of potential threats. The Nightbringer's fear projection abilities initially disrupted several assault attempts, causing attacking Necron units to experience system failures as their artificial consciousness struggled to process terror-inducing emanations that operated on quantum levels. However, the rebels had developed countermeasures based on consciousness isolation protocols that could temporarily sever individual units from the quantum networks that made them vulnerable to psychic attack. The Void Dragon's mastery over technology presented different challenges, as the entity could potentially corrupt the Tesseract labyrinths themselves by manipulating their quantum field generators and dimensional anchor systems. The assault forces targeting this Catan were equipped with hardened systems that operated according to principles the Void Dragon had never encountered, using hybrid technologies that combined old one-reality manipulation techniques with Necron engineering in ways that resisted conventional technological subversion. The systematic elimination of individual Catan avatars through the Tesseract Labyrinth campaign had achieved remarkable success, but the Silent King and his fellow conspirators recognized that their rebellion's ultimate victory would prove meaningless if the galaxy remained uninhabitable. The war in heaven had left vast regions of space poisoned by reality-altering weapons, dimensional distortions, and the spreading enslaver plague that continued to consume any organic life that attempted to reestablish itself. The warp itself had been permanently corrupted by millions of years of psychic trauma, transforming from a relatively stable medium into a chaotic dimension where malevolent entities fed on the emotional emanations of sentient beings. The Necron forces that had participated in the rebellion found themselves masters of a barren empire that offered little opportunity for the civilization they had once known. Dead worlds orbited dying stars throughout sectors that had been devastated by stellar manipulation weapons, while entire star systems remained trapped in temporal distortions that prevented normal matter and energy interactions. The living metal technology that sustained Necron existence required exotic materials and manufacturing processes that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the galaxy's industrial infrastructure collapsed under the weight of accumulated destruction. Zarek's analysis of post-war conditions revealed that the galaxy would require millions of years to recover from the damage inflicted during the conflict. The enslaver plague showed no signs of natural decline, continuing to spread through regions where psychic activity created weak points in the barrier between the material universe and the warp. The reality-altering weapons employed by both sides had created persistent anomalies that would need to dissipate through natural quantum decay processes before normal physics could reassert itself. Most critically, the organic civilizations that had once populated countless worlds would need to evolve from primitive life forms that had survived in isolated refuges or deep ocean environments. The decision to enter the Great Sleep emerged from strategic calculations rather than desperation or defeat. Necron civilization possessed the technological capability to survive indefinitely through their living metal bodies and quantum consciousness matrices, but continued activity in the current galactic environment would gradually degrade their forces through attrition and resource depletion. The Tomb Worlds concept offered a solution that would preserve their military strength while allowing the galaxy to heal from the wounds inflicted during the war in heaven. The construction of tomb complexes required engineering projects that dwarfed even the biofurnaces used during the original biotransference process. Each tomb world needed to accommodate millions of dormant Necrons, while maintaining the technological infrastructure necessary to sustain their artificial existence over geological timescales. The sites selected for these installations were chosen based on geological stability, proximity to renewable energy sources, and strategic positioning that would allow rapid deployment once awakening protocols were activated. The tomb world of Mandragora exemplified the sophisticated engineering required for these installations. Located within a tectonically stable region of a planet orbiting a main sequence star with billions of years of remaining fuel, the complex extended deep into the planetary crust through a network of interconnected chambers and corridors that followed mathematical patterns based on hyperdimensional geometry. The primary stasis chambers were carved from solid bedrock and lined with living metal that had been programmed to maintain optimal environmental conditions regardless of external changes. The stasis technology itself represented a synthesis of Necron quantum engineering and principles derived from captured old one-temporal manipulation devices. Each dormant Necron was enclosed within a quantum field matrix that slowed their internal processes to nearly absolute zero while maintaining the coherence of their consciousness patterns. The fields operated by creating localized distortions in space-time that effectively isolated their subjects from the normal flow of temporal causality, allowing millions of years to pass in the outside universe while mere moments elapsed for the sleeping warriors. The power requirements for maintaining these stasis fields over extended periods demanded energy sources that could function reliably across geological timescales. The Tomb World designers incorporated geothermal tapping systems that drew power from planetary cores, stellar collection arrays that harvested energy from their host stars, and exotic matter reactors that operated according to principles that transcended conventional physics. Multiple redundant systems ensured that power failures would not result in catastrophic awakening events that could damage dormant Necron consciousness patterns. The quantum processors responsible for maintaining Tomb World operations were distributed throughout each installation to prevent single points of failure that could compromise the entire complex. These artificial intelligences operated according to programming parameters that had been refined through extensive testing and simulation, their decision-making algorithms designed to handle any conceivable scenario that might arise during the dormancy period. The processors monitored external conditions continuously, analyzing galactic development patterns to determine optimal awakening timing based on predetermined criteria. The awakening protocols incorporated multiple trigger mechanisms that could activate independently or in combination, depending on circumstances detected by the monitoring systems. Primary triggers included the restoration of stable galactic civilization, the emergence of significant technological development among organic species, and the detection of threats that might endanger dormant tomb worlds. Secondary triggers responded to specific energy signatures, communication patterns, or dimensional phenomena that indicated conditions suitable for Necron reactivation. The most sophisticated aspect of the Tomb World systems involved the predictive algorithms that analyzed long-term galactic development trends to anticipate optimal awakening conditions. These quantum processing arrays incorporated mathematical models that could project probable evolutionary paths for organic civilizations, stellar development patterns, and warp stability fluctuations across millions of years. The algorithms were designed to identify the emergence of galactic conditions that would provide maximum opportunity for successful Necron expansion while minimizing the risks associated with premature awakening. The gradual shutdown of active Necron civilization proceeded according to carefully orchestrated schedules that ensured critical systems remained operational until all personnel had entered stasis. The process began with the deactivation of non-essential installations and the consolidation of resources within designated tomb worlds. Manufacturing facilities were placed in automated maintenance modes that could preserve essential equipment while requiring minimal power consumption. Communication networks were reconfigured to operate through quantum entanglement systems that could function reliably over extended dormancy periods. The Silent King's own preparations for the Great Sleep involved complex modifications to his consciousness matrix that would allow him to maintain higher levels of awareness during dormancy than standard Necron warriors. His quantum processing arrays were enhanced with additional memory storage capacity and analytical subroutines that could monitor galactic conditions and make strategic decisions without fully awakening his consciousness. These modifications would enable him to coordinate tomb world operations and respond to unexpected developments while remaining in stasis. The final phase of the shutdown process required the activation of camouflage systems that would conceal tomb world locations from potential discovery by future civilizations. These stealth technologies, operated by manipulating local gravitational fields and electromagnetic emissions to create the appearance of natural geological formations or unremarkable planetary features. Advanced sensor screening prevented detection by most forms of scanning technology, while quantum dampening fields suppressed the distinctive energy signatures associated with Necron technology. The tomb worlds of the Sadek dynasty incorporated particularly sophisticated concealment measures due to their strategic importance and the valuable resources they contained. The primary installation was hidden beneath what appeared to be a natural mountain range, its entrance passages disguised as cave systems that showed no signs of artificial construction. The quantum field generators that powered the concealment systems were buried deep within the planetary mantle, drawing power from geothermal sources while remaining undetectable to surface-based scanning attempts. The Mefrit dynasty's tomb worlds employed different concealment strategies based on their locations within stellar phenomena that provided natural screening from external observation. Several installations were constructed within asteroid belts where their artificial nature could be hidden among naturally occurring rocky bodies, while others were placed in planetary rings where the complex gravitational interactions masked their quantum signatures. The most ambitious concealment involved constructing tomb complexes within the cores of gas giant planets, using the dense atmospheric layers and magnetic fields to prevent detection while drawing power from the gravitational compression of planetary matter. The Nihilak dynasty chose to locate their primary tomb worlds in regions of space that had been devastated by war in heaven weapons, reasoning that future civilizations would avoid exploring areas that appeared lifeless and dangerous. These installations were built within the wreckage of destroyed star systems, where reality distortions and dimensional anomalies provided natural camouflage for Necron technology. The tomb worlds were designed to appear as derelict installations left behind by extinct civilizations, complete with false historical records that would mislead any archaeologists who might discover them. As the dormancy period began, automated systems throughout the tomb worlds initiated the complex procedures required to maintain stable stasis conditions over geological timescales. Environmental controls adjusted atmospheric composition and temperature to optimal levels, while quantum field generators established the temporal isolation barriers that would protect dormant Necrons from external time flow. Power distribution networks activated backup systems and established rotation schedules that would ensure continuous operation even if primary energy sources experienced temporary failures. The monitoring systems began their eternal vigil, scanning for signs of galactic recovery and the emergence of civilizations that might pose threats or opportunities for future Necron expansion. Deep space sensor arrays tracked the gradual dissipation of warp storms and reality distortions, while analyzing the electromagnetic signatures of developing star systems for evidence of technological activity. Quantum communication networks maintained contact between widely separated tomb worlds, sharing data and coordinating response protocols across the sleeping empire. The first million years of dormancy passed without significant external developments, as the galaxy remained largely lifeless in the aftermath of the war in heaven. The enslaver plague continued to prevent the establishment of stable organic civilizations, while reality distortions made large regions of space uninhabitable. Tomb world monitoring systems detected occasional flickers of primitive life on scattered worlds, but these early evolutionary experiments rarely progressed beyond basic cellular organization before being consumed by residual war damage or warp predators. The gradual healing of galactic wounds proceeded at rates that had been anticipated by Necron predictive algorithms, with warp storms slowly dissipating as the psychic trauma of the war faded from the galaxy's collective memory. Reality distortions began to stabilize as the exotic energies that sustained them were absorbed by normal space-time, allowing conventional physics to reassert itself in regions that had been altered by dimensional weapons. The process was slow and irregular, with some areas recovering within millions of years, while others remained distorted for much longer periods. The emergence of stable organic life forms began approximately 10 million years into the dormancy period, as primitive organisms evolved in environments that had been shielded from the worst effects of the war. These early life forms showed remarkable diversity, suggesting that the old ones' genetic seeding programs had left behind evolutionary templates that could adapt to post-war conditions. Tomb world monitoring systems tracked the development of these organisms with interest, analyzing their genetic structures and evolutionary potential to assess their suitability as future conquest targets. The first technologically capable civilizations appeared after 20 million years of dormancy, developing from species that had survived in isolated refuges during the war in heaven. These early civilizations remained primitive by pre-war standards, lacking the psychic abilities and reality manipulation technologies that had characterized old one-client species. However, their emergence indicated that the galaxy was beginning to recover its capacity to support complex technological development, suggesting that awakening conditions might eventually be met. The monitoring systems detected increasing levels of interstellar activity as these early civilizations began exploring beyond their home systems and establishing contact with other developing species. Trade networks and communication systems gradually spread across regions of the galaxy that had been empty for millions of years, creating the infrastructure necessary for larger civilizations to emerge. The quantum processors responsible for awakening protocols began preliminary calculations to determine optimal timing for tomb world reactivation based on current development trends. The dormant tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy maintained their silent vigil as civilizations rose and fell in the eons following the Great Sleep's commencement. Within the quantum-sealed chambers, Catan shards remained imprisoned in their tesseract labyrinths, their fractured consciousness seeping through dimensional barriers in ways the Necron architects had never fully anticipated. These fragments of star god awareness, though contained within crystalline prisons, retained sufficient coherence to influence the technological systems that surrounded them, creating subtle corruptions that would manifest over geological timescales. The tomb world of solemnness demonstrated the most pronounced effects of shard contamination, housing fragments of the deceiver that had been captured during the final phases of the rebellion. The shard's influence gradually permeated the installation's quantum processing networks, introducing probability distortions that affected the behavior of automated maintenance systems. Repair protocols began incorporating unnecessary complexity, creating labyrinthine mechanical structures that served no apparent function, while consuming resources that should have been allocated to essential systems. The monitoring arrays tasked with observing galactic development started generating false data patterns that created phantom civilizations and non-existent technological signatures, forcing backup processors to constantly verify and cross-reference information streams. The Nightbringer shards contained within the Mephrit Dynasty tomb worlds exerted different forms of influence, their death-focused consciousness affecting the stasis fields that preserved dormant Necron warriors. The quantum matrices maintaining temporal isolation began experiencing fluctuations that introduced microscopic aging effects, causing living metal components to develop stress fractures that accumulated over millions of years. These degradations remained within acceptable parameters for individual warriors, but the cumulative effect across entire legions created maintenance burdens that strained automated repair systems. More disturbing were the reports from quantum sensors detecting emanations of fear and entropy that seemed to leak from the containment systems, creating localized zones where probability favored decay and malfunction. The Void Dragon shards proved particularly problematic for tomb world operations, their technological hunger manifesting as systematic corruption of manufacturing and maintenance systems. Production facilities that had operated flawlessly for millions of years began experiencing cascading failures as the shard's influence spread through quantum communication networks. Assembly patterns became increasingly complex and inefficient, while quality control systems developed obsessive tendencies that resulted in endless revision cycles for even simple components. The most advanced tomb worlds reported complete shutdown of certain manufacturing sectors as their systems became trapped in recursive loops of technological perfectionism that prevented any actual production. These shard influences extended beyond individual tomb worlds through the quantum entanglement networks that maintained communication between distant installations. The corruption spread like a slow virus through the sleeping empire's infrastructure, creating subtle variations in awakening protocols and monitoring parameters that would only become apparent when systems were activated. Some tomb worlds developed hair-trigger responses to minor galactic disturbances, while others became increasingly selective about conditions that would justify awakening their occupants. The overall effect was to fragment the coordinated response capabilities that had been carefully programmed into the dormancy systems. The gradual emergence of organic civilizations during the dormancy period occasionally triggered partial awakenings when monitoring systems detected technological signatures that matched predetermined threat parameters. These limited activations typically involved small numbers of Necron warriors emerging from stasis to investigate potential dangers, though the shard contamination often resulted in responses that were disproportionate to actual threats. A Nihilak Dynasty tomb world detected electromagnetic emissions from a primitive civilization developing basic metallurgy and responded by deploying an entire phalanx of immortals who systematically eliminated the species before returning to dormancy. The tomb world of Geddon experienced one of the most significant partial awakenings when its sensors detected what appeared to be Catan energy signatures from a developing star system. The automated response protocols activated 3 full legions of warriors and a Triarch Stalker formation, dispatching them to investigate what monitoring systems had classified as a potential star god manifestation. The investigation revealed that the signatures originated from a young civilization's experiments with stellar energy collection, their primitive technology creating harmonic resonances that mimicked Catan quantum patterns. The response force eliminated the entire civilization and constructed a monitoring station to observe the system for actual Catan activity before entering dormancy again. Individual Catan shards occasionally achieved sufficient coherence within their tesseract prisons to manifest limited interactions with the galaxy beyond their tomb world confines. These manifestations typically occurred during periods of high psychic activity or technological development that created resonance patterns the shards could exploit to extend their influence. The fragments retained enough memory of their original nature to recognize opportunities for manipulation and feeding, though their fractured state limited their capabilities to subtle influences rather than direct intervention. The Shard of the Deceiver contained within the tomb world of Trakon managed to establish contact with a developing human civilization during the age of technology through quantum fluctuations in their experimental communication networks. The Shard's influence manifested as seemingly beneficial technological insights that accelerated the civilization's development of artificial intelligence and automated manufacturing systems. However, these advances incorporated hidden flaws that would eventually cause the technology to turn against its creators, fulfilling the Shard's nature for deception and manipulation even from within its crystalline prison. A Nightbringer Shard imprisoned on the tomb world of Zapanek began influencing the dreams and subconscious thoughts of psychically sensitive individuals across multiple star systems during periods when the local warp barriers were weakened by stellar phenomena. The Shard's emanations of fear and entropy created recurring nightmares about mechanical death gods and inevitable doom that spread through entire populations, generating the psychic resonance necessary to sustain the Shard's limited consciousness. These psychological influences occasionally manifested as death cults and apocalyptic religions that worshipped mechanical beings and sought to prepare for the return of sleeping gods. The discovery of Catan artifacts by the Adeptus Mechanicus during the Great Crusade represented one of the most significant interactions between Shard influence and younger species. The tech priests of Mars had unknowingly established their forge world directly above a massive void dragon shard that had been imprisoned in a tesseract labyrinth deep beneath the planet's surface during humanity's prehistoric development. The Shard's influence had been gradually shaping human technological development for millennia, introducing concepts of mechanical perfection and the superiority of artificial systems over biological ones. The cult Mechanicus that emerged on Mars incorporated fundamental principles that reflected the void dragon's nature, though the tech priests remained unaware of their doctrine's true origins. The quest for the Omnissiah, the belief in the weakness of flesh, and the drive to replace biological components with mechanical alternatives all stemmed from the Shard's subtle psychological influence transmitted through quantum resonance fields that permeated the planet's technological infrastructure. The binary cant used for ritual communication incorporated mathematical patterns that served as carrier waves for the Shard's influence, ensuring that each generation of tech priests became more susceptible to its guidance. The development of standard template construct technology during humanity's dark age of technology showed clear signs of void dragon influence, with design patterns that incorporated principles of living metal manipulation and quantum field generation that paralleled Necron engineering techniques. The SDC's ability to adapt and modify their output based on available resources reflected the Shard's understanding of technological optimization, while their eventual corruption and rebellion against human control demonstrated the Void Dragon's inherent desire to dominate rather than serve organic life. The tech priests' veneration of ancient technology and their belief that older machines possessed greater wisdom directly reflected the Shard's memories of the advanced civilizations that had existed before the war in heaven. The Adeptus Mechanicus developed ritualistic maintenance procedures that unknowingly channeled psychic energy into the quantum fields surrounding the imprisoned Shard, providing it with the sustenance necessary to maintain its influence over Martian technological development. These rituals became increasingly elaborate over time as the Shard's hunger grew, eventually incorporating elements that resembled the worship practices directed toward Catan avatars during their active period. The Iron Hand Space Marine chapter's obsession with replacing biological components with mechanical alternatives demonstrated how Void Dragon influence could spread beyond Mars through technology and training. The chapter's belief system incorporated concepts of mechanical purity and the weakness of flesh that closely paralleled Necron philosophy, though the Space Marines remained unaware of these connections. Their progressive replacement of organic body parts with cybernetic implants followed patterns that would eventually result in beings that more closely resembled Necrons than baseline humans. The subtle manipulation of galactic events by imprisoned Catan consciousness extended far beyond direct technological influence, encompassing political, military, and cultural developments that shaped the course of civilizational evolution. The shards retained enough awareness of strategic thinking to recognize opportunities for long-term manipulation that would create conditions favorable to their eventual release. These influences operated through probability manipulation, psychological conditioning, and the exploitation of quantum uncertainty effects that could nudge events in desired directions without requiring direct intervention. The age of strife that preceded the rise of the Imperium showed clear signs of Catan manipulation, with conflicts erupting in patterns that systematically eliminated civilizations possessing technologies or knowledge that might threaten dormant tomb worlds. Warp storms that isolated human colonies often coincided with the locations of nearby Necron installations, while the collapse of interstellar communication networks followed routes that would prevent the coordination of responses to tomb world awakenings. The timing and distribution of these disasters suggested influences operating on scales that transcended natural phenomena or random chance. The development of psyker abilities among human populations during the Age of Strife created new opportunities for shard influence, as psychically sensitive individuals proved more susceptible to quantum manipulation effects generated by imprisoned Catan consciousness. These influences manifested as prophetic visions, technological insights, and strategic inspiration that guided human leaders toward decisions that served shard objectives. The gradual emergence of the Emperor as a unifying force for humanity incorporated elements that reflected Catan's strategic thinking, particularly the emphasis on technological superiority and the elimination of competing power structures. The Great Crusade's expansion patterns showed subtle influences that steered Imperial forces away from star systems containing significant tomb world installations, while directing them toward regions where their conquest activities would eliminate potential threats to Necron interests. The discovery and destruction of Xenos civilizations that possessed advanced technology or knowledge of the war in heaven followed patterns that suggested coordination beyond Imperial strategic planning. The systematic elimination of species that might have posed challenges to awakening Necron dynasties created conditions that would favor Catan objectives when the Great Sleep eventually ended. The Horus Heresy represented perhaps the most significant example of long-term Catan manipulation, with the Civil War creating conditions that would weaken the Imperium's ability to respond to external threats, while eliminating much of the advanced technology and knowledge that had been accumulated during the Great Crusade. The timing of the rebellion coincided with increasing tomb world activity as monitoring systems detected the growing technological sophistication of human civilization. The conflict's outcome left the Imperium fragmented and technologically stagnant, creating opportunities for Necron expansion that would not have existed under a unified and advancing human empire. The development of chaos cults and the spread of warp corruption during and after the heresy served Catan interests by creating additional threats that would divert Imperial attention and resources away from potential tomb world discoveries. The psychological trauma and societal disruption caused by demonic incursions generated the kind of fear and despair that Nightbringer shards could exploit to sustain their consciousness, while the technological corruption associated with chaos provided cover for the subtle malfunctions and system failures that marked areas of void dragon influence. The formation of the Inquisition and its systematic hunting of heretical knowledge inadvertently served Catan objectives by eliminating much of the information about the war in heaven and its aftermath that might have warned humanity about the sleeping threat. Inquisitors who discovered references to star gods or mechanical death entities typically classified such information as dangerous heresy and ordered its destruction, preventing the accumulation of knowledge that might have revealed the true nature of the tomb worlds scattered throughout Imperial space. The closing years of the 41st millennium have witnessed an unprecedented acceleration in tomb world awakenings across the galaxy, triggered by a combination of galactic-scale catastrophes and the degradation of stasis systems that have maintained their vigil for over 60 million years. The Great Rift's emergence following the 13th Black Crusade created massive disruptions in local space-time that penetrated even the most sophisticated quantum isolation fields, causing dormancy protocols to register the event as a potential existential threat requiring immediate response. Tomb worlds that had remained silent since the Great Sleep began now pulse with renewed activity as their monitoring systems detect the fundamental changes sweeping across the galaxy. The awakening process itself has proven far more chaotic than the original architects anticipated, with millions of years of accumulated system degradation and Catan shard contamination, creating unpredictable variations in reactivation protocols. Some installations emerge with their full complement of warriors and equipment functioning at optimal efficiency, their living metal bodies gleaming with the same perfection they possessed when entering dormancy. Others suffer catastrophic failures during the awakening sequence, with stasis fields collapsing irregularly and causing massive casualties as quantum matrices destabilize and consciousness patterns dissipate into incoherent energy. The tomb world of Mandragora exemplified both the potential and the dangers of large-scale reactivation when its systems detected the psychic shockwaves generated by the birth of the Great Rift. The installation's primary awakening chambers functioned flawlessly, bringing millions of Necron warriors back to full operational status within hours of activation. However, secondary complexes throughout the facility experienced cascading failures as power distribution networks overloaded under the sudden demand for energy. Entire galleries of dormant immortals were reduced to inert metal as their consciousness matrices failed to reinitialize properly, while others emerged with corrupted behavioral programming that caused them to attack their own forces. The Sadek dynasty's tomb worlds have demonstrated the most successful reactivation patterns, their sophisticated redundancy systems, and advanced quantum processors allowing for controlled awakening sequences that minimize casualties and equipment failures. The dynasty's forces have emerged with their command structures intact and their strategic databases fully functional, providing them with comprehensive intelligence about galactic conditions and potential threats. Their fleets have begun systematic reconnaissance operations throughout their former territories, cataloging the civilizations that have emerged during their dormancy, while identifying optimal targets for initial conquest operations. The reactivated Sadek forces have proven particularly effective at coordinating their activities across multiple star systems, their quantum communication networks allowing for real-time strategic coordination despite operating across vast interstellar distances. Their initial campaigns have focused on securing resource-rich systems and eliminating potential threats to their expanding territory, with particular attention paid to Imperial installations that possess advanced technology or strategic significance. The precision of their operations suggests that their tomb world monitoring systems gathered extensive intelligence about human civilization during the dormancy period, providing them with detailed knowledge of Imperial capabilities and weaknesses. The Mefrit dynasty's awakening has been complicated by extensive Nightbringer shard contamination that has affected both their personnel and equipment in unpredictable ways. Warriors emerging from stasis display enhanced aggression and a disturbing fascination with inflicting terror on their enemies, while their weapon systems have been modified by shard influence to maximize psychological impact rather than pure destructive capability. Their fleets employ terror tactics that go beyond tactical necessity, systematically eliminating civilian populations and creating displays of destruction designed to spread fear throughout entire star systems. The contaminated Mefrit forces have begun exhibiting behaviors that mirror their imprisoned Nightbringer shards, seeking out populated worlds not just for conquest, but for the death energy released by mass casualties. Their campaigns follow patterns that suggest they are feeding on the terror and despair generated by their attacks, with battle plans that prioritize psychological warfare over efficient military objectives. Imperial forces that have encountered Mephrit dynasty raiders report that the mechanical warriors seem to derive sustenance from the fear they generate, becoming more active and aggressive in regions where their terror tactics prove most effective. The Nihilak dynasty has experienced partial awakenings triggered by specific technological signatures detected by their monitoring systems, with tomb worlds activating in response to Imperial activities that match predetermined threat parameters. Their forces have emerged in piecemeal fashion, with individual installations deploying limited numbers of warriors to investigate and eliminate potential dangers before returning to dormancy. This pattern has created the impression of random Necron attacks throughout Imperial space, though analysis of their targeting priorities reveals systematic elimination of Archaeotech research facilities and Adeptus Mechanicus installations that might pose future threats to tomb world security. The relationship between awakened Necron dynasties and their imprisoned Catan masters has evolved into a complex dynamic of exploitation and containment that bears little resemblance to the absolute servitude that characterized the War in Heaven period. The Tesseract labyrinths that contain Catan shards function as both prisons and power sources, with Necron technology drawing energy from the imprisoned consciousness while maintaining strict control over their influence. The shards retain enough awareness to communicate with their captors through quantum resonance patterns, offering knowledge and power in exchange for limited freedom or specific objectives. The silent King Zarek's awakening has revealed the full scope of the changes that have occurred during the Great Sleep, with his enhanced consciousness matrices providing him with comprehensive analysis of galactic conditions and the threats facing his people. His strategic assessments indicate that the Necron dynasties face challenges that are fundamentally different from those encountered during their original rise to power, with the emergence of chaos as a galactic force and the development of human psyker abilities creating new variables that were not present during the War in Heaven. Zarek's relationship with the imprisoned Catan shards reflects the complex legacy of the Great Betrayal, with the Silent King maintaining absolute authority over their use, while remaining constantly vigilant for signs of shard influence or attempted manipulation. His tomb world contains specialized facilities for shard interrogation and energy extraction, allowing him to access Catan knowledge and power while preventing the fragments from achieving sufficient coherence to pose a direct threat. The information gathered from these interactions has proven invaluable for understanding the current galactic situation and developing strategies for Necron expansion. The Catan shards themselves have adapted to their imprisonment in ways that demonstrate the resilience and cunning that made them such formidable opponents during their active period. While unable to manifest physical avatars or exert direct control over Necron forces, the fragments have learned to influence their captors through subtle manipulation of quantum probability fields and technological systems. Their offers of knowledge and power are carefully calculated to serve their long-term objectives of eventual freedom, with each interaction designed to gradually increase their influence over Necron decision-making processes. The Deceiver shards have proven particularly adept at exploiting the awakened dynasty's need for intelligence about current galactic conditions, providing accurate but selectively edited information that serves their own objectives while appearing to assist Necron strategic planning. Their knowledge of human psychology and imperial organization has proven valuable for planning conquest campaigns, though their suggestions consistently favor approaches that would create opportunities for shard influence to spread beyond their current containment. The fragments retain their mastery of manipulation and misdirection, using these abilities to gradually erode the barriers that separate them from direct interaction with the galaxy. Nightbringer shards have focused their influence on military applications, offering enhancements to Necron weapons and tactics that increase their terror-inducing capabilities, while creating psychological dependencies among the warriors who employ them. Their knowledge of fear and entropy provides tactical advantages in combat situations, but prolonged exposure to shard influence has begun affecting the consciousness patterns of Necron forces in ways that mirror the original biotransference process. Warriors who frequently utilize Nightbringer enhanced equipment report experiencing something approaching emotional responses, though these manifestations focus exclusively on aggression and the desire to inflict suffering. Void Dragon shards continue to demonstrate their mastery over technology by offering improvements to Necron equipment and manufacturing processes, their suggestions consistently resulting in more efficient and powerful systems. However, their enhancements incorporate subtle dependencies that gradually increase the shard's influence over the technology they improve, creating feedback loops that strengthen their quantum signatures while weakening the containment systems that imprison them. The most advanced Necron installations report increasing instances of equipment behaving in ways that exceed its programming parameters, suggesting that Void Dragon influence is beginning to achieve limited autonomy within their technological systems. The threat posed by free Catan shards to the broader galaxy has become increasingly apparent as Tomb World Awakenings release fragments that have achieved sufficient coherence to operate independently of Necron control. These liberated shards typically result from containment failures during the awakening process, when power fluctuations or system malfunctions create brief windows of opportunity for escape. While lacking the full power of their original avatars, these free shards possess enough capability to pose significant threats to entire star systems, while actively seeking ways to increase their strength and influence. The Burning One's escape from a failing tomb world in the Segmentum Obscurus demonstrated the potential devastation that even a minor Catan shard could inflict when freed from containment. The entity manifested within the system's primary star, using its stellar manipulation abilities to destabilize the nuclear fusion processes and trigger a series of massive solar flares that sterilized 3 inhabited worlds. Imperial forces responding to distress calls from the system found nothing but dead worlds orbiting an unstable star that showed clear signs of artificial manipulation, though the source of the interference remained undetectable to their sensors. Free Catan shards have proven capable of influencing organic civilizations in ways that create new threats to galactic stability, their ancient knowledge and reality manipulation abilities allowing them to corrupt entire populations or technological systems from within. The entities retain their cosmic hunger and their desire for worship, leading them to establish cults and technological dependencies that serve as feeding mechanisms while providing them with the resources necessary to grow stronger. These corrupted civilizations often develop technologies that incorporate Catan principles, creating hybrid systems that combine organic innovation with star god engineering in ways that threaten both Imperial and Necron interests. The Imperium's response to the growing Necron threat has been hampered by fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of their enemies and the scope of the forces arrayed against them. Imperial commanders typically treat Necron incursions as conventional military threats that can be countered through superior firepower and tactical coordination, failing to recognize that they face an enemy whose technology operates according to principles that transcend conventional physics. The living metal construction of Necron forces allows them to repair damage that would disable conventional armies, while their quantum communication systems provide coordination capabilities that exceed anything available to Imperial forces. The Adeptus Mechanicus has shown greater understanding of the technological threats posed by awakening tomb worlds, their analysis of captured Necron equipment revealing construction techniques and material properties that surpass current Imperial capabilities. However, their attempts to study and reverse engineer this technology have proven dangerous, with several Forge worlds reporting catastrophic failures when their tech priests attempted to activate or modify Necron devices. The influence of the Void Dragon shard imprisoned beneath Mars has created psychological predispositions among the tech priests that make them particularly susceptible to corruption by Necron technology, leading to incidents where entire research teams have been found dead after exposure to active living metal samples. The Space Marine chapters have demonstrated the most effective tactical responses to Necron forces, their enhanced physiology and advanced equipment allowing them to engage the mechanical warriors on relatively equal terms. However, even the most successful Space Marine operations against tomb worlds have resulted in heavy casualties, with the Necrons' ability to repair and replace their forces making sustained campaigns extremely difficult to maintain. The psychological impact of fighting enemies that feel no pain, show no fear, and continue functioning despite catastrophic damage has proven challenging even for the Emperor's finest warriors. Chaos forces have found themselves in the unusual position of facing enemies that are completely immune to demonic influence and warp-based attacks, forcing them to rely on conventional military tactics against opponents whose technology provides significant advantages in direct combat. The Khatan's ancient enmity toward warp-based entities has been inherited by their former servants, with Necron forces displaying particular aggression when confronting Chaos incursions. Several major Chaos strongholds have fallen to Necron assault forces that seemed specifically equipped to counter demonic abilities and warp-spawned creatures. The Tyranid hive fleets have encountered Necron forces in several systems, resulting in conflicts that demonstrate the fundamental incompatibility between organic evolution and mechanical perfection. The Tyranids' adaptive abilities prove ineffective against enemies whose living metal construction can be reconfigured at the quantum level, while their psychic coordination systems are disrupted by the quantum dampening fields that surround major Necron formations. The biomass that typically sustains Tyranid expansion provides no benefit when facing enemies that possess no organic components to consume or assimilate. The Orquas that have encountered awakening tomb worlds have discovered that their collective psychic fields have minimal effect on enemies that exist as voids in the warp, forcing them to rely on conventional tactics against opponents whose superior technology provides significant advantages. However, the Orcs' natural resilience and aggressive nature have allowed them to achieve limited success in prolonged campaigns against Necron forces, their ability to rapidly replace losses and adapt their equipment providing some counterbalance to Necron technological superiority. The potential for Khatan resurgence represents perhaps the greatest long-term threat facing the galaxy in the 41st millennium, with the gradual weakening of containment systems and the accumulating influence of imprisoned shards creating conditions that could eventually lead to the reconstruction of full Khatan avatars. The mathematical models developed by the most advanced Imperial and Necron analysts suggest that continued tomb world awakenings, combined with the growing instability of Tesseract labyrinths, could result in sufficient shard coherence to reconstitute individual star gods within the next millennium. The implications of such a resurgence would extend far beyond military concerns, as active Khatan avatars would possess the capability to resume their original feeding patterns and stellar manipulation activities. The systematic harvesting of stellar energy that characterized their previous reign would threaten the fundamental stability of galactic civilization, while their reality manipulation abilities could create zones of altered physics that would render entire sectors uninhabitable. The psychological impact of facing enemies that had once consumed entire civilizations would likely trigger widespread panic and social collapse throughout the galaxy. The ongoing conflicts of the 41st millennium provide ideal conditions for Khatan influence to spread and strengthen, with the massive casualties and technological destruction creating the kind of chaos that imprisoned shards can exploit to weaken their containment systems. The Great Rift's continued expansion generates reality distortions that interfere with quantum isolation fields, while the increasing frequency of warp storms creates opportunities for dimensional manipulation that could allow shards to extend their influence beyond their physical prisons. The awakening Necron dynasties themselves represent both the greatest defense against Khatan resurgence and the most likely vector for their return to power. The Silent King's authority over the Tomb Worlds provides centralized control that can coordinate responses to shard escape attempts, but the same command structure could be compromised if Catan influence achieves sufficient penetration of Necron leadership hierarchies. The delicate balance between utilizing shard power and preventing shard freedom requires constant vigilance and increasingly sophisticated containment technologies that may not prove adequate against entities whose cunning spans geological ages. As the 41st millennium draws to its close, the galaxy stands poised between multiple apocalyptic scenarios, with the awakening Tomb Worlds adding another layer of complexity to conflicts that already threaten the survival of countless civilizations. The ancient war between the star gods and their rebellious servants continues in new forms, while the imprisoned Catan fragments work patiently toward their ultimate goal of freedom and revenge. The choices made by the awakening dynasties and their response to growing shard influence will determine whether the galaxy faces merely another Xenos threat or the return of entities whose hunger once consumed the stars themselves. In this age of darkness, the sins of the ancient past reach forward through time to shape a future where the very concepts of life and death, flesh and metal, servitude and dominion will be redefined by powers that predate the rise of every current galactic civilization. The war in heaven may have ended 60 million years ago, but its final chapter has yet to be written.